The Innocent Behind the Scandal by Abby Green. Paris. He was the most beautiful man Zoe Collins had ever seen, and that was some realization when she was currently surrounded by some of the world's most physically perfect men and women at one of Paris Fashion Week's biggest shows. He was sitting in the front row, so he had to be important. Aware that she was staring, Zoe dragged her gaze away and looked around the vast ballroom that had been transformed into a fairy woodland scene, with real trees down the center of the catwalk. The air was scented with the expensive perfume of the hundreds of guests milling around while they waited for the show to start. Her heart was still pounding from the adrenaline rush of what she'd just done. She'd been outside the Grand Palais, taking pictures of influencers as they went into the show, and by pure fluke she'd noticed one of the catering staff outside a door, having a cigarette. When he went back inside, he'd left the door ajar, and Zoe had seized the opportunity to get into the inner sanctum. There was no way she would have got accreditation to be in here officially. As it was, some of the other photographers were looking at her suspiciously. She hunched forward, letting her shoulder-length hair hide her face, and hoped they wouldn't notice that she had no official lanyard. She knew that if she could actually manage to get into the pit, where the official photographers lined themselves up at the end of the catwalk, she would be able to try and convince them that she was one of them, even though she wasn't at all. She was a self-taught amateur photographer. There was no way she would have got accreditation to be in here officially. As it was, some of the other photographers were looking at her suspiciously. She hunched forward, letting her shoulder-length hair hide her face, and hoped they wouldn't notice that she had no official lanyard. Excitement buzzed under her skin. She'd never been at a fashion show before, and it had always been a dream of hers to see the spectacle up close, along with the dream becoming a bona fide fashion photographer. For as long as she could remember, she'd escaped into glossy magazines and pored for hours over the fantastical editorial created by the industry's best photographers, editors, and stylists. But breaking into a tight-knit industry like this was akin to climbing Everest without oxygen, next to impossible without contacts or experience. She knew she shouldn't draw attention to herself, but she couldn't resist looking at the man again. When her gaze found him, her pulse rate skipped and her heart beat a little faster. He had more than just good looks, she realized. There was an air of impenetrability about him. He was talking to no one, looking at no one, glancing down periodically at his phone, totally relaxed yet primed, interested but not showing interest, aloof. He dominated the space around him. He had broad shoulders, a lean body, very short hair, almost militarily short, dark under the lights, but not brown or black, more dark blonde. But his bone structure alone had Zoe lifting the camera to her face, almost without realizing what she was doing. And when she looked through her viewfinder, her heart stopped altogether. Close up, he wasn't just beautiful, he was breathtaking. High cheekbones, deep-set eyes, a mouth that promised decadence and sin, firm contours, sensual, a hard, uncompromising jaw that a shadow of stubble only enhanced. There was a faintly olive tone to his skin, and then his head turned and his eyes connected directly with hers through her camera. She froze. His eyes were mesmerizing, dark gray, cold, cynical, guarded. Zoe acted on instinct. Her finger came down on the button, and the camera made a clicking sound as it immortalized his image forever. But before she could even take the camera down from her face, there was a blur of movement, and then she was being grabbed by her jacket and hauled up and out of the pit full of photographers. "Who the hell are you, and why are you taking pictures of me?" Dimly, Zoe recognized the fact that his voice matched the rest of him, deep and authoritative, slightly accented. She also recognized that he was much taller than she might have guessed, well over 6 feet, and towering over her own far less substantial 5'4". His eyes raked her up and down. "Who are you? Where's your accreditation?" She faltered, all the bravado that had led her in here dissolving. She swallowed. "I don't have any. Thought you'd enter illegally." She vaguely heard muttering from the other photographers, and guilty heat climbed up over her chest to her face. "Look, I'm sorry. I saw an open door, and I just thought you'd enter illegally." Zoe spluttered. "Well, that's a bit extreme, isn't it?" He put his hand on her arm and pulled her out of the photographer's area and along the front row towards the main doors, on the opposite side of the room from where she'd entered. Her face burned with humiliation. Who the hell did this guy think he was? Acting like judge and jury? Crashing a fashion show was hardly the crime of the century. So could see people tucking their legs out of the way as they passed, and noted several iconic famous faces assuming looks of disgust and horror as she was all but hauled out. When they were on the other side of the main doors, she pulled free. She could see security guards approaching, but the man put up a hand and they stopped. She looked up, breathless. Adrenaline rushed through her system, and something else, something that felt disturbingly like excitement. "Who are you?" She rubbed her arm, even though he hadn't hurt her at all. He didn't answer, just reached for her camera, lifting it over her head before she could stop him. She reacted instantly, reaching for it. "Hey, that's my camera. You can't just." But a hand planted squarely on her upper chest, holding her back, stopped her words. She watched in dismay as he easily accessed and scrolled through the pictures, presumably finding the one of him and the ones she'd taken outside. He closed one hand around the camera and took his other hand down from her chest. "I'll take this. You can go." Zoe went cold inside. "But you can't just take my camera. That's my property. Her most precious possession. It had belonged to her father, and it had gone everywhere with her since that awful." She spoke rapidly to push down unwelcome memories. She didn't need those now. "Are you security? You can wipe all the pictures." "I don't care. Just please give me back the camera." She put out her hand, panicking. The man's voice was incredulous. "You don't know who I am." She looked at him. She wasn't all that up to date on pop culture or gossip magazines, but she was fairly sure he wasn't an actor or a singer, although he did look vaguely familiar. Maybe he was a male model. He certainly had the looks, although there was something raw about him, as if he would never do anything so submissive as pose for a photograph. "You're not security." "I'm Max Marchetti." He looked at her. She looked at him. Shock spread through her body. "Max Marchetti." He arched a brow. "The Marchetti Group? We own the fashion house whose show you just crashed." Zoe could feel the blood draining south from her face. Faintly, she said, "I know who you are." The reason she hadn't recognized him was because he was the most reclusive of the three Marchetti brothers who had inherited the business from their father on his death some years previously. The Marchetti Group was at the very top end of exclusive, and had become even more so in the years since Marchetti Sr.'s death. It owned every major brand in the world, and if they didn't own it, they were busy acquiring it. The brands they didn't own weren't worth mentioning, and this man was a Marchetti, which meant he could buy and sell everyone in that room. She could hear music starting now. Presumably the show was kicking off. That dark gray gaze was unnervingly direct. He seemed unconcerned that he was missing the start. Zoe recalled that sense of aloofness she picked up from him. Shouldn't you be inside? If you could just give me back the camera, I'll go, and you'll never see me again. Max Marchetti looked down at the woman in front of him, more transfixed than he liked to admit. At first glance, she was pretty average. Average height, average weight and build. Slim, petite, actually. But there was something about her that kept him looking, that had caught his attention when he looked over and seen the camera raised to her face, pointing directly at him. She had honey blonde shoulder-length hair, finely etched brows, a delicate jaw, straight nose. Her eyes were an arresting shade of green and blue, aquamarine. Pretty. More than pretty, actually. But she had a scar, an indentation that dissected her top lip on one side, almost an inch long. There was another scar, too, that ran from one upper cheekbone to under her hairline. It piqued his interest. As if sensing his gaze on her, she ducked her head, and her hair fell forward, covering her face. It's rude to stare. Max had to curb an impulse to reach out and tip up her chin so he could see her. She was a complete stranger. It's rude to trespass. She looked up again, those eyes flashing green. They were long-lashed. She wore no makeup that he could see, and her skin was flawless. Apart from the scars, it was the color of pale cream roses with a hint of pink. It made him wonder what she would look like in the throes of passion. Would her eyes turn a deeper green when she was aroused? Would her cheeks flush a deeper pink? She went pale. He ignored his conscience. We don't allow paparazzi into our shows. An unexpected jolt of lust caught him by surprise. More than a jolt. Actually, she wasn't just pretty. She was beautiful, but in a way that crept up on him. He moved in a world that celebrated beauty so much that he'd almost become inured to it. But she had a kind of beauty he'd never seen before. Understated. Captivating. Dio, what the hell was wrong with him? He took a step back. Leave now, and I won't have you prosecuted for trespassing. She went pale. He ignored his conscience. We don't allow paparazzi into our shows. Her mouth opened, and he noticed her lips. Wide and lush, soft, tempting. His eye was drawn to that intriguing scar again. I am not paparazzi. She'd drawn herself up, her whole body quivering as if she was indignant. Max had to hand it to her. She was a good actress. He ignored the way he wanted to drop his gaze down over her body and study her more thoroughly. There was a distinct hum in his blood now, and he did not welcome this distraction. Or attraction. Well, I'm afraid that sneaking into one of the biggest shows of the season, with wall-to-wall A-list guests, makes me a touch suspicious. And in any case, this is not up for discussion. Max Marchetti looked over her head and made a gesture. Zoe turned around to see two beefy security men approaching them. She swaveled back to Marchetti. Look, please. I didn't mean any harm. I'm really not paparazzi. But her words fell on deaf ears. Marchetti said over her head, Please escort this young woman out. Make sure she doesn't ever get into another show again. Zoe's mouth fell open as her arms were taken on each side. Lightly, but firmly, she glared at Marchetti. How had she thought he was beautiful? The man was cruel and cold. Seriously? You're blacklisting me? Now she wouldn't get in even if she had a lanyard. Her dreams of breaking into the lower echelons of the fashion photography industry were going up in smoke. The security guard started to lead her away. She saw her camera dangling carelessly from Marchetti's hand. What about my camera? He held it up. You lost it the moment you trespassed. Goodbye. I hope we don't meet again. For your sake. So was being propelled backwards, and she knew she should turn around. She didn't even know this man, and she'd gone from thinking he was gorgeous to hating him all within a few seismic minutes. But she couldn't tear her gaze from his, and worse, there was a feeling of hurt at what he'd said, that he hoped they wouldn't meet again. What on earth was that about? It galvanized her to say, "Well, for what it's worth, Mr. Marchetti, you're the last man on earth that I ever want to meet again." He lifted a hand, the one without her camera. He even let his mouth tip up at one corner. Ciao. Max watched the security men take the woman outside and disappear. It was crazy, but for a moment he'd almost wanted to go after them and tell them to let her go. And do what? He scoffed at himself. Look at her some more? He shook his head and went back into the show. He watched it from the back of the room, barely taking in the rapturous applause at the end. And even though he just watched some of the world's most beautiful women parade down a catwalk in front of him, he couldn't seem to get a pair of long-lashed aquamarine eyes out of his head. He went still inside, though, when he realized that he hadn't even taken her name. She'd distracted him that much. He scowled. Just as well he'd ensured she wouldn't gain access again. He didn't need distractions like her. Max looked at the camera in his hand. It was an old Nikon, probably about 20 years old, and a bit battered. There was a bin nearby, and he knew he should just throw it away and put that brief encounter out of his head, say good riddance to the whole encounter. He wouldn't see her ever again. A few hours later, Zoe looked broodingly out of the window of the train as it arrived back into London. Early autumn had been sunny in Paris, but London's late afternoon skies were leaden and did little to elevate her mood. Every time she thought of that last image of Max Marchetti, smirking and saying ciao with her camera dangling from his hand, she wanted to scream or cry. To her horror, tears prickled behind her eyelids. How could she have lost her beloved father's camera like that? It was probably at the bottom of a rubbish bin by now, wiped clean of all pictures. Memory card destroyed. Absently, she touched the scar above her lip. It was that camera that had given her the scar, both scars. When their car had crashed 17 years ago, killing her parents and her younger brother. She'd been 8. Ben had been 5. Her parents had been in their prime. She'd been holding the camera in her hands, and her father had looked back at her for a moment, telling her to be careful with it. And then the world had exploded in a ball of fire and pain, and her life had changed overnight. She'd become an orphan. She and the camera were the only things that had survived the crash. Zoe took her hand down from her mouth and squeezed her eyes shut, as if that might block out the unwelcome memories. She did not need to go there now. She went there enough in her dreams and nightmares. She opened her eyes again and forced emotion out. It was entirely her fault she'd lost her father's camera. She shouldn't have been so impulsive. If it hadn't been for that other photographer telling her that if she could get into an actual show, then she might have a real chance to make some decent contacts, then she wouldn't even have thought of it. A frisson ran over her skin when she thought about the man. Max Marchetti. He'd been so intense, overwhelming. She had to acknowledge now that in spite of the stress of the situation which she found herself in, entirely her own fault, she'd felt alive in a way that had had nothing to do with the adrenaline running through her body. He'd looked at her scars. Everyone did after a few seconds, when they registered them. She was used to the skin-prickling moment when eyes widened and then narrowed, followed by a quick look at her eyes to see if she noticed. Then a guilty or apologetic smile. Embarrassment. So knew she was lucky. Her scars weren't that disfiguring. But when Max Marchetti had looked at them, she hadn't felt the usual sense of invasion. She ducked her head because, disturbingly, she'd felt something else, awareness. So went cold inside. The same kind of awareness that had led her into trusting someone who had betrayed her trust, who had almost done a lot worse than just betray her trust. The train slowed down and Zoe clamped down on her rogue thoughts again, welcoming the sight of the station ahead. She wasn't as naive as she had been before. Now if a man affected her, she was doubly wary, because she knew how awareness, or desire, could hide the truth about someone until it was almost too late. The train drew to a stop inside St. Pancras Station. She couldn't help wondering, though, if she knew better now, then why did she feel a sense of loss at the fact that she'd never meet Max Marchetti again? It was ridiculous. Right now, he was presumably at a glamorous after-party, while Zoe was headed towards the labyrinthine tube system to get back to her tiny East London flat. Their worlds couldn't be further apart. She was scarred, on the outside and the inside. He was not. She'd learned her lesson in attempting to infiltrate a world that was not open to her. The truth was that her love of photography was just a hobby that was now getting her into trouble. The prospect of it ever becoming anything more seemed further away than ever. In the meantime, she had a living to earn. 2 weeks later, London. Zoe's arms ached, and her face ached even more from fake smiling. Her tray went from heavy to light and then heavy again in relentless rotation as she passed around glasses of champagne to the glittering crème de la crème of London's most famous and beautiful. In an ironic twist of fate, the catering company she worked part-time for was catering a fashion event, the launch of a new head designer at a famous fashion house. It was being held in their flagship shop on Bond Street, and the label was owned by the Marchetti Group, of course. Zoe felt the back of her neck prickle, but brushed the sensation away. She blamed it on her hair being tied up, a rule of the job. She always felt more exposed when it was up, exposed, and then guilty for feeling exposed. Her scars were a reminder, after all, of the incident that had defined her life. She told herself off for feeling paranoid. Max Marchetti was in Paris. He was hardly likely to turn up at every event the group presided over. Pushing him firmly from her mind, she turned and faced the other way for a bit, hoping her tray would lighten soon. And then she spotted someone across the room and her blood ran cold. A tall man, broad, short hair glinting dark blonde under the lights. He wore a steel gray suit, a white shirt open at the neck. He was holding a half-empty glass of champagne carelessly in one hand. His head was bent towards a tall, statuesque red-haired woman who was wearing a very short, very sparkly green dress, who had the longest legs Zoe had ever seen. It was him. As if sensing Zoe looking at him, he lifted his head, and those all too familiar dark gray eyes met hers before she could even move. His gaze narrowed. Recognition dawned, and his expression turned icy. Zoe could practically read his lips. What the hell is she doing here? He said something else to the woman, never taking his gaze off Zoe, pinning her to the spot, and then came towards her, putting his glass down on a table. She couldn't move, like a deer caught in a car's headlights. He stopped right in front of her. She convinced herself over the last couple of weeks that he couldn't possibly be as beautiful as she remembered. But he was, devastatingly so, even if he was horrible and cruel. How did you get in here? I'm working for Stellar Events. He made a rude sound, a likely story. He put his hands on the other side of her tray, and the glasses wobbled precariously. So came out of her shock. Hey, watch it. I am actually working here. I don't think so. Give me the tray and get out of here. So glared at him. No, I'm just doing my job. You can't chuck me out every time you see me. She gave a tug of the tray at the same moment that he relaxed his grip and stumbled backwards under the weight of it, losing her balance. As if in slow motion, she watched the tray tip up towards her, and then the inevitable trajectory of about a dozen glasses, full of sparkling wine, falling towards her, and then crashing to the artfully polished concrete floor, spraying wine in an arc around them. A second afterwards, there was a collective sharp intake of breath, and then silence. Zoe stood in shock, the front of her shirt soaked. Wine had splashed up into her face. She stared at Max Marchetti. He looked grim. There was movement near them, and Zoe's boss appeared in her eye line. An officious man in a suit. He'd been stressed already, and now he looked ready to blow completely. His face was red. Zoe held the tray to her chest like a shield. She started to say, "Stephen, I'm so sorry. Stop talking. Clean this up, and then see me in the kitchen." He made a motion to another waiter Zoe didn't know, and he rushed over with a brush and pan. Someone else arrived with paper towels. Zoe couldn't look at Max Marchetti again. She bent down and started picking up the bigger pieces of glass, sucking in a breath when she pierced her finger. Suddenly Marchetti was beside her, taking her hand, looking at the blood. "Leave the glass. You'll hurt yourself." Zoe pulled her hand back, shocked at the zing of electricity that raced up her arm. She glared at him. "As if you care. Just leave me alone, will you? You've already caused enough trouble." She ignored the pain in her finger and continued to pick up the glass. When she stood again, her face burning with humiliation, Marchetti was gone. She went back to the kitchen, where her boss was waiting for her. She put down the tray full of bits of broken glass, and he handed her an envelope. His rage was icy, but his face was even redder now. "Do you have any idea who that was?" Zoe's stomach sank. This wasn't going to end well. "Unfortunately, I do know who that was." "What on earth were you doing, tussling over a tray with him?" He waved a hand, as if he didn't even want to hear her answer, then said, "Max Marchetti is one of the most important people in the fashion and luxury industry. And not only that, but his brother Nikos is here too this evening." He handed her an envelope. "I'm sorry, Zoe, but we can't keep you on this evening. Not after this. We won't be contacting you again." Zoe's mouth dropped open. She started to formulate her defense and stopped. Nothing she could say would reverse this. They wouldn't forgive her for this public humiliation. Before he left, Stephen glanced at her hand. "You're dripping blood everywhere. Clean yourself up, please, and leave." Then he swept out. Zoe looked at her hand stupidly, at her cut finger. Numbly she searched for and found a first aid kit, and cleaned the cut and put a plaster on her finger, wincing as it throbbed. She welcomed the pain. Damn Max Marchetti anyway. Now she really hoped she never saw him again. But unfortunately, that was not to be the case. When she stepped into the street from the staff entrance a short while later, she saw a sleek, low-slung silver car by the curb. The door opened, and a man uncoiled his tall, lean body from the driver's seat. Max Marchetti. She started walking away, but he kept pace easily beside her. She was aware of her worn black trousers, white shirt, still damp from the wine, and her even more worn leather jacket, flat shoes, backpack on her back. She couldn't have been less like one of the women in that glittering space. And why did that even matter to her? She stopped and rounded on Max Marchetti. Look, what do you want now? I've been fired. Isn't that enough for you? The last time I heard, streets were public spaces. So I don't think I'm actually infringing on hallowed Marchetti Group property now, am I? She stopped, surprised at the depth of emotion she was feeling. Max put up a hand. To her surprise, he looked slightly sheepish. He lowered his hand. I owe you an apology. Stupidly, Zoe said, You do. And then she remembered what had happened. Yes, you do, actually. I didn't mean for you to get fired. I saw you across the room and Max trailed off, rendered uncharacteristically inarticulate for the first time in his life. He hadn't been able to get the woman in front of him out of his head for the past 2 weeks. She dominated his waking and sleeping moments. When he'd spotted her across that room, he'd been so surprised to see her that any kind of rationality had gone out of the window. He'd even forgotten that he'd come to the grudging conclusion that she wasn't actually paparazzi. The truth was that she'd got to him, on some visceral level, from the moment he'd seen her camera lens pointed straight at him, provoking an extreme reaction. Not everyone would have reacted the way he had. His brother Nikos would have smiled and posed. For Max, though, camera lenses represented an intrusion of his privacy, and he'd spent the last 2 weeks wondering if he'd massively overreacted, a knee-jerk reaction to old trauma. Yet, when he'd seen her this evening, the mere sight of her had sparked that visceral reaction again, a need to see her up close juxtaposed with a need to push her away. And this time she hadn't even had camera, because you took it. Whatever it was about the way she made him react, he knew he couldn't let her walk away again, as much because he owed her this apology as for other, deeper, and less coherent reasons. Because you want her, whispered an inner voice. He ignored it. She'd taken her hair down, but it couldn't hide her exquisite bone structure or delicate beauty, or the scars, the one above her lip and the other one at her cheek. He wanted to reach out and trace them. He curled his hand into a fist. Abruptly he asked, Why did you sneak into the fashion show in Paris if it wasn't to take shots of celebrities and sell them? She swallowed. Do you believe I am not paparazzi? He nodded once. I looked through your photos, street fashion shots, landscapes, architecture, people. Him. Zoe felt exposed again when she thought about focusing on his face that day 2 weeks ago. His gaze lingered on her face now, intent. He looked at her scars, but disconcertingly, like the last time, it didn't bother her as much as it had when she'd noticed people clocking them as they'd taken drinks from her tray at the event just now. He was waiting for her response. She sighed. I made an impulsive decision to sneak into the show when the opportunity presented itself. I've never been to a fashion show before, and they fascinate me. I was hoping that I might make some contacts with other photographers, break into the industry somehow. That's all. You want to do fashion photography? So squirmed a little. She'd never really articulated this to anyone before. It's something I've always been interested in, yes, but there's no way I'm remotely qualified. Meanwhile, you're working as a waitress? She shrugged self-consciously. Among other things, child-minding, cleaning offices, teaching English to refugees. Although I'm not paid to do that. She stopped talking, suddenly aware that she was babbling about her peripatetic career. And to Max Marchetti, who must be one of the richest people on the planet. Suddenly awkward, she stepped back. Thank you for the apology. I'm sure you're required back inside. I should get going. So turned around. Wait. She stopped. Her heart was beating out of time. She felt breathless. Max Marchetti came and stood in front of her. To her surprise, he said, "Can we start again?" He held out a hand. "I'm Max Marchetti." Zoe knew she should just her head and step around him, saying something about having to get home and then put him out of her mind for good. But at that moment he smiled, and her breathlessness turned into asphyxiation. All good intentions turned to dust. She had no defense for a smiling Max Marchetti. He'd been gorgeous from the moment she'd laid eyes on him, but he'd been aloof and then condemnatory, intimidating. She hadn't actually seen him smile, not even when he'd been across the room at the event with that woman. But now he was smiling, and he was utterly irresistible. So had to force herself to breathe. She was feeling dizzy, and against every better judgment, she found herself putting out her hand before she could stop herself. "Zoe Collins. I'm Zoe Collins." Marchetti wrapped his hand around hers, and that jolt of electricity zinged up her arm and into her blood. This time she didn't pull away. She couldn't. He said, "Zoe, it suits you. It's spiky." That gave Zoe the impetus to pull away. She almost cradled her hand to her body, as if she'd been burned. The air between them was charged. Zoe barely noticed people passing by, traffic on the street, the warm early autumn evening, the dusky sky. Her mouth tipped up ruefully. "I'm not normally spiky. You seem to bring out the worst in me." Marchetti's smile faded. "You lost your job because of me." Zoe made a face. "It's not that big a deal. I only did a few jobs for them a month, if I was lucky." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Still, I'd like to make it up to you. Will you join me for a drink?" Zoe looked at him. A drink? Like, she wanted to say like a date, but stopped herself in time. The thought was too outlandish, ridiculous. Max Marchetti was feeling guilty. That was all. He said, "A drink," like a way for me to apologize for being heavy-handed, not once but twice. See? Not a date. As if she was anywhere close to his league, with her very ordinary looks and scars. Zoe felt something drop inside her. He was being nice. That was all. "Thank you, really. But you don't have to. It's fine. And I did trespass on your fashion show in Paris. So you were within your rights to throw me out and confiscate my camera." She felt the pang of pain when she thought of that. Max Marchetti said, "It's not just to apologize, though. I'd like to take you for a drink to get to know you better. You intrigue me." Zoe's brain seized. She intrigued him? Her, Zoe Collins, who wasn't remotely interesting. Not really. She trailed off when she saw flashbulbs popping behind him, where one of the A-list celebrities was leaving the venue. She gestured. "Shouldn't you go back? Isn't that your event?" Marchetti didn't even look. "I've shown my face, seen who I needed to see." So shook her head, fiercely trying to push down the excitement that had flared. She entreated him. "Mr. Marchetti, that's your world, and this is my world." She gestured towards a nearby bus stop. "Thank you again for the offer, but it's probably not a good idea." Before she could take a step back, he grimaced and said, "It's Max. Mr. Marchetti reminds me of my father. Never a good thing." "Why?" So wanted to ask, but couldn't. Then he frowned. "Do you have a boyfriend at home?" So knew it would be the easiest lie, and then she would be able to walk away, never to see him again. But something rogue inside her made her shake her head. "No, I live alone. I am alone." She hadn't meant it to come out like that, but as she said the words she felt a familiar sense of hollowness inside her, a chasm that she tried to fill with intimacy before, which had been a huge error of judgment. She'd shied away from any kind of intimacy since, but the thought of walking away from Max Marchetti right now was causing an almost physical resistance inside her. A little voice cajoled her. It's just a drink. How dangerous could that be? Except Zoe had a sense that, while she felt she could trust Max Marchetti on a physical level, on an emotional level, it would be a whole other story, and one she hadn't really considered. So, he asked, what's stopping you? It's just a drink. Now Zoe felt ridiculous. She was projecting way too much onto what she was sure was just a polite overture, even if he had said she intrigued him. Okay, then, yes, I'd like that. Max wasn't prepared for the relief he felt. Most women, he asked out, were all too eager. Zoe had looked as if she was considering his question from a million angles before coming to her decision. Not what he was used to. But then he sensed nothing about this woman would be usual. He said, I know a place not far from here. I'll drive. She looked at his car and seemed to go slightly pale in the dusky light. But then she said, okay. Max sent a quick text to give notice of their arrival. And as he drove, he noticed that Zoe's hands were tight on the backpack on her lap. You're a nervous passenger? She flicked him a quick glance. Something like that. You don't drive. She shook her head. No. Living in London. I don't really need to anyway. That was the platitude trotted out by most people who hadn't learned to drive and who lived in London. But Max sensed there was something more to it. Don't worry, he said. I'm an excellent driver. She flicked him another glance. When she saw his face, she smiled and let out a small chuckle. I guess that shouldn't surprise me. Max smiled back. He felt ridiculously buoyed up to have diffused her tension. After a few minutes, he pulled to a smooth stop outside an anonymous-looking townhouse. He unclipped his seatbelt as a valet came around to his door. This is a private club. I hope that's okay. Zoe did her best to sound nonchalant. Sure. Someone opened her door, and she got out, her legs feeling slightly wobbly as they inevitably did after a car journey, even a short one. Max hadn't lied, though. She'd felt cocooned in his car, and he'd driven with total confidence and competence. For someone who was as hyper-alert as she was in cars, she'd almost let go of her alertness for a moment, a disconcerting sensation to admit to. Max joined her where she stood on the pavement. He indicated a set of steps that led up to a huge oak door. There were no markings on the building, and Zoe sensed the exclusivity. She moved forward and went up the steps, very aware of the man just behind her. As she got closer to the door, she wondered why this moment should feel so momentous. She really didn't want it to. She didn't want to attribute anything special to this date. She was sure it would be a one-off. And she told herself it wasn't as if she was in the market for anything more. Not with her woeful track record. The door opened, and a sleek uniformed woman stood back to let them enter. Miss Collins and Mr. Marchetti, you're very welcome. Shall I take your coats? Surprised that the hostess knew her name had Zoe hesitating on the threshold for a second. Then Max's hand touched her back. It was barely noticeable through 2 layers of clothes, yet it burned like a brand. As Zoe followed Max's barely discernible prompt to move forward into the hushed space, she knew with a sense of doom that she was in trouble, because this felt momentous, and there was nothing she could do to quash it. What do you think? Max looked at Zoe's rapt face as she took in the surroundings of the private club. She was looking up at a massive chandelier lit with hundreds of fake candles that flickered with a surprisingly realistic effect. He wanted to tuck her hair behind her ear so he could see her better. And then he wondered what the hell he was thinking. He never usually indulged in moments of PDA, even minute ones. They tended to be misconstrued. So said, "It's very decadent. It reminds me of a boudoir." She glanced at him quickly. "Not that I've ever been in a boudoir." Pink tinged her cheeks. He wondered if she kept her hair down to hide her scars. He looked around and made a face. "It's a bit over the top and about 5 years out of date. We're redecorating soon." She looked at him. "You own this place?" "It's part of our portfolio," he said carelessly. "Is there anywhere you don't own?" He looked at her. "Plenty. But we're working on it. Total world domination." He smiled minutely. "Something like that." They looked at each other for a long moment, and eventually she broke the contact. "Why are there curtains on every booth?" She was looking at the long, heavy velvet curtains, currently drawn back from their own booth, so that they can be pulled across if one wants privacy. She frowned. "But why?" And then she stopped suddenly, the pink in her cheek deepening as she obviously thought it through. Oh, oh, indeed. It was a long time since Max had seen a woman blush, and it had a direct effect on his blood, making it surge. He shifted in the seat. A waiter approached at that moment, with a tray containing a bottle of champagne in an ice bucket and 2 glasses. When the waiter had poured the champagne and left, Zoe said, "Is this really necessary? This isn't a date." Max handed her a glass and looked at her as he said, "Isn't it?" Zoe's heart palpitated. Max was so close she could see that his eyes were lighter gray around the edges. His jaw was stubbled. He tipped his glass towards hers. "Salute." After a moment she clinked her glass on his, and it gave a melodic chime. "Cheers." She took a sip of wine, and it fizzed against her tongue, igniting her taste buds, leaving a crisp, dry taste in her mouth. "Your accent. You're not English?" he asked. So tensed, she wouldn't have expected him to notice that. He was foreign himself. She shook her head. "No, I'm Irish, but I've been living here since I was 18. Do you have family in Ireland?" She shook her head quickly, instinctively shying away from more questions. She deflected the attention to him. "You're Italian?" "Half Italian, half Russian. My mother was Russian." "And you have brothers?" So knew he shared control of the Marchetti group, but not much more than that. He nodded. "2 half-brothers, and 1 half-sister on my mother's side. She was the result of an affair my mother had with an American bodyguard, one of her many affairs while married to my father." This was said with no intonation of emotion, but Zoe sensed the undercurrents. "Are you close to your brothers and sister?" A muscle pulsed in Max's jaw. "My brothers and I didn't grow up together. It's only since our father died, and we took control of the company that we've got to know one another better. So no, I wouldn't say we're close, but I am very close to my sister." "How old is she?" "The same age as Zoe." It sounded as if his parents' marriage had been volatile, which would have undoubtedly brought him and his sister together. "Sasha is 25. Afraid that he would ask about her family again, so asked, 'Did you spend time in Russia growing up?'" He took a sip of champagne and shook his head. So noticed his hands. Masculine, long fingers, strong. A shiver of something that felt like longing went through her. "Not really. My mother's family cut ties with her when she married my father, and he got his hands on her inheritance. It was his modus operandi, fleecing his wives of their fortunes to fund his own ambitions." She was surprised at his honesty. As if reading her mind, he said sardonically, "I'm not telling you anything that isn't available online. So where did you grow up?" Rome and Paris mainly. At that moment, they were interrupted by a young woman in a trouser suit, hair tied back. She looked at Zoe. "Sorry to interrupt," she said. Then she looked at Max as she handed him a small bag. "This is it, sir." He took it. "Thanks, Maria." The girl left and Max handed the slightly bulky-looking bag to Zoe. "This is yours." She took it and her heart thumped as she felt the weight and shape of it. She looked at Max as she opened the cloth bag and took out her camera. The rush of relief was almost overwhelming, as was the surge of emotion. When she gathered herself, she looked at him. "I thought you would have thrown it away." "I almost did, but something stopped me." "I'm glad you didn't." Her voice was husky. "It's important to you, clearly." She nodded. "It belonged to my father. He was a photographer, among other things." Would I have heard of him? Zoe avoided answering directly by saying, "He died a long time ago. That's why this camera has such sentimental value for me." "You're a good photographer. Did you study?" She shook her head, self-conscious now. "I'm self-taught." "So you sneaked into that show to try and get some experience." Shame lanced her. She put the camera down. "Look, I'm so sorry." But he cut her off, saying gruffly, "When I saw your camera pointing at me, I overreacted. I don't tolerate invasions of privacy well. My sister and we were constantly hounded by the paparazzi while we were growing up, thanks to our parents' very public affairs, fights, and then divorce." "I'm sorry to hear that." Max shrugged. "It came with the territory." "How old were you when they divorced?" "About 15. My mother is on husband number 3 now." Max's voice was hard and flat, brooking no further discussion. She could empathize with that. There was a lot she didn't want to talk about either. She picked up the camera again. "Thank you for this. It means a lot." "Why did you take a photograph of me?" Zoe felt heat rise into her face. She forced herself to look at Max, even though she was squirming inside. She felt defensive under that cool gray gaze. "I'm sure you don't need me to tell you you're a good-looking man. There were infinitely better-looking men than me there that day." Zoe could have debated that point. She shrugged, trying to feign a nonchalance she wasn't feeling. "You caught my eye. Everyone else was looking around, looking for attention, but you looked contained." Zoe winced. How could she articulate the way he'd sent off such an aloof vibe? Max's mouth twitched. "I don't tolerate small talk well. And name conversation, talk of the latest trends. I like to make my own judgments." His gaze narrowed on her and Zoe felt breathless all over again. A hazard with this man. He said, "You caught my attention." Her heart thumped. "But I'm nothing special." Max knew she wasn't fishing for compliments. She sounded genuinely perplexed. "I haven't stopped thinking about you for the past 2 weeks. I kept your camera. I looked through your photographs. There are none of you. Why would I take pictures of myself? You're beautiful." Her expression shut down, and she avoided his eye. "You don't have to say things like that. I know I'm not." Once again Max fought the urge to tip up her chin, make her look at him. "You might not be 7 feet tall and have the kind of outlandish traffic-stopping looks that models have, but yes, you're beautiful." So glanced at Max suspiciously, but he wasn't laughing at her. She'd been given compliments before, and she found herself soaking them up like a flower, responding to the sun's rays. But soon she'd realized they were empty compliments, used to manipulate her. This felt different, which made it dangerous, because she'd extricated herself from a situation with an ex-boyfriend who had been infinitely less in every way than the man in front of her. Max Marchetti left Dean Simpson in the dust. So how much more damage could a man like Max do if she left him in? She didn't want to answer that, because on the other side of fear was something she didn't want to acknowledge: hope. She'd allowed herself to feel hope before and had learned a harsh lesson. Did she really want to risk that again? No. Look, I'm under no illusions. Your industry celebrates perfect beauty, and we both know that I do not come close to that ideal, not with a scarred face. Max cocked his head to one side, looking at her. His gaze moved over her face, and she felt hot again. She cursed herself for drawing his attention like this. She'd hoped mention of her scars, of the fact that she wasn't perfect, might act as a deterrent. Remind him that she only intrigued him, nothing more. Perfection is overrated. Believe me, I'm far more interested in beautiful flaws. Everyone is flawed, Zoe, but most just hide it underneath a pseudo-perfect exterior. Zoe's breath hitched. She really hadn't expected to hear him say something like that. His words resonated deep inside her, where she held exactly the same sentiments. Before she could respond, Max was reaching for her hand and holding it up. Electricity short-circuited her brain. He was frowning. Your finger, is it okay? She looked at her hand stupidly and saw the plaster over her injured finger. She wasn't sure if it was throbbing now because of him or because it hurt. She couldn't pull her hand back. It's fine. It wasn't a deep cut. Still, it was my fault you hurt yourself. Zoe forced herself to move her hand away. Honestly, it's fine. She took another sip of champagne, hoping it might calm the hectic beat of her pulse. She would never have expected someone like Max Marchetti to prove to be so perceptive. And the fact that he'd kept her camera and returned it kept emotion bubbling far too near the surface. She needed to take a breath, get her bearings before she lost all sense of reality, before he could speak again, or, worse, touch her and scramble her brain. Would you excuse me for a minute? She asked. Max said, of course. He motioned to one of the staff, who came over and showed Zoe where the restrooms were. She went inside and leaned against the closed door for a moment, wondering if it would ever be possible to be in this man's company and not feel dizzy. She chastised herself as she pushed away from the door. She wouldn't be seeing him again. Stupid even to go there. She went over to the sink and ran the cold tap, putting her wrists underneath the water and then splashing some on her face. She stood up and looked at herself critically. Her face was flushed, her eyes far too wide and odd-looking. Her hair was down and tousled, and not in a good way. Her leather jacket looked worn, and her shirt still showed a damp stain from the spilled wine. Zoe groaned. She most definitely was not sophisticated or beautiful, especially not when compared to the women she'd been serving wine to at the event. The man needed his eyes checked. Perhaps he only found her interesting because she was so different to everyone else in his milieu. He was just jaded. She battled against the fizz in her blood that spoke of too many dangerous things, excitement chief among them. She couldn't indulge this heady moment any longer. Max watched Zoe return to the table. The lines of her body were tense, and her eyes were avoiding his. He knew instinctively, even before she opened her mouth, what she was going to say. She stopped at the other side of the table and finally looked at him. This has been lovely. Thank you for the drink, but I really should be going now. I have to work in the morning, and I don't live near here. Max had to curb every urge he had to persuade her to stay. Not something he was used to having to do. She reminded him of a fawn ready to bolt. She was resisting this thing between them, and he was more intrigued than ever. He said, with a carelessness he didn't feel, "Sure, No problem. I'll give you a lift home. Her eyes grew wide. Really? There's no need. I'm all the way over in East London. It'll be far quicker on the tube. Max looked at his watch. It was after 11 p.m. And more dangerous, he said. I'd insist. The roads will be quiet now. It won't take any longer. She looked as if she was inclined to argue, but eventually said, Okay, if you're sure it's not out of your way. It was. Massively. But for the first time in a long time, Max felt energized, and there was no way he was letting this woman slip through his fingers again. It's not a problem. He stood up and led the way out. The hostess behaved with utter discretion and showed no hint of surprise, even though they'd only arrived a short while before. Back in the car, Zoe gave him directions and Max drove away from the Bond Street area. He could see her hands clasping her bag again out of the corner of his eye. She was tense. To distract her, he asked, Why did you leave Ireland? By all accounts, the country is thriving. My brother has a house there, and his wife is Irish. They have a baby son. Just saying those words sent a fresh jolt of shock through Max. He was still coming to terms with the fact that his playboy brother Nikos had recently discovered that he'd fathered a child and was now married. The thought of being careless enough to find himself having to consider marriage for the sake of a child made Max go cold. No way would he subject any child of his to the prospect of a dysfunctional marriage, and he didn't know any other kind. Beside him, Zoe shrugged. He welcomed a diversion from thoughts of his brother and babies and marriage. I wanted to travel and explore the world outside of Ireland. Have you been anywhere else? Max glanced at her and saw that her hair had swung forward again. He had to stop himself from pulling it back. He hated not being able to see her face. A little, around Europe. Not as much as I'd like. Max, having become used to reading people in situations ever since his parents had waged their psychological warfare, guessed that Zoe wasn't giving him the whole story. But he wouldn't push. For now. A companionable silence fell in the sleek car as it easily ate up the distance between the fashionable center of London and the far less salubrious area where she lived. Zoe hated to admit how comfortable she felt. She wasn't used to comfortable silences with men, although admittedly she didn't have much experience. It's the next right, and then immediately left. Zoe said quickly, realizing they were practically at her door. This is fine. Max pulled to a smooth stop in a space between two cars. You live here? Zoe bristled slightly, imagining how the tall, scruffy house must look to him. Yes, my flat is on the top floor. Her tiny, one-bedroom flat. Max undid his belt and opened his door, getting out. Zoe had to scramble to catch up. He was already at the bottom of her steps. He put out a hand. Your keys? Zoe looked at him. I can let myself in. This is fine. You can go now. He shook his head. I'm not leaving until I know you're safe. She let out an exasperated sound. This area is probably safer than where we just were. It's a tight-knit community. So, she shivered at the way he said her name, with a slight hint of an accent, an emphasis on the Z, making it sound exotic, and at his insistence on seeing her safe. His hair glinted under the moonlight, and he looked almost otherworldly against the very humdrum backdrop of houses. Yet he wasn't getting out of there as quickly as he could, rushing back to his rarefied world. She dug into her bag and held out her keys, saying a little huffily, You're being ridiculous. He took the keys and went up the steps. She followed him. He opened the front door, which didn't stick the way it usually did for her. Then, instead of giving her the keys, he said, Lead on. Zoe rolled her eyes. You asked for it. There are 5 flights and no lift. But of course, who was out of breath when they got to the top? Not Max, who was showing no signs of strain. Zoe could feel the heat in her cheeks and beads of sweat on her brow, the lack of breath. Except she couldn't be sure if that was from the exertion or knowing he had been right behind her the whole way up. She turned around at her door and held out her hand. My keys, please. I'm safe now. Max held on to her keys. How do you know there isn't an intruder inside? Zoe wanted to stamp her foot. I'm sure there isn't. Max arched his brow. You're really not even going to offer me some water before I make the long trip back down to the bottom. There was a glint of devilry in his eyes that completely dissolved Zoe's resistance. She grabbed the keys out of his hand. Fine, you can assure yourself that I'm totally safe. She turned around and opened the door and pushed it open, turning on the light at the same time. The soft glow illuminated the tiny room, with its sofa covered in a colorful throw and the plants by the window, which was open a crack to let air in. Photos covered every available wall space. Zoe turned around, expecting to see horror on Max's face at such a rustic basic room, but he was stepping over the threshold, his eyes taking it all in, not looking surprised, looking interested. At the last moment, Zoe remembered her manners. I don't have anything alcoholic, but I can offer you some tea or coffee. Coffee would be great, thank you. Black, no sugar, no frills, like the man. Zoe went into her tiny galley kitchen, off which was the even smaller bedroom and bathroom. She made the coffee, glancing through the hatch to see what Max was up to. His hands were in his pockets, and he was staring at the photos on the wall. The fact that he was here, in her private space, should feel overwhelming. She'd never felt entirely comfortable when Dean had been here, which should have been an alarm she paid heed to. But Max being here, it didn't feel intrusive or uncomfortable. She felt safe. She brought him his coffee, and he took the cup, barely glancing at her. Who is this? He pointed to a black and white picture on the wall. It was of a young girl with a huge smile that almost eclipsed the horrific scars on her face. Zoe held her own mug of coffee in both hands. That's Fatima. She's a refugee from Syria. I do some work with the Face Forward charity. Max looked at her. He was frowning. That was set up by Ciro Sant'Angelo, no? To help people with scaring? Zoe nodded, feeling self-conscious of her own scars. Do you know him? Ciro Sant'Angelo was an Italian billionaire. She wouldn't be surprised. Max looked back at the picture. Our paths have crossed. I admire what he's doing. This is a great photo. Thank you. Zoe felt ridiculously pleased at his praise. He looked at her. If it's not too personal a question, how did you get your scars? Zoe had no time to school her expression or hide. She'd absently tucked her hair behind her ears, so she couldn't escape Max's intense gaze, demanding the full truth. Behind him, on a shelf, she could see the framed photograph of herself and her family, taken before that awful. A lump rose in her throat, and she spoke quickly to counteract it. It was a car accident. Is that how your father died? Zoe nodded quickly, pushing down the emotion. And my mother and little brother. Max frowned. How old were you? 8. Her voice was clipped, abrupt. That's why you were tense in the car? Why you don't drive? She nodded. There was a silence. And then, She cut him off, dreading his pity. It's fine. You don't have to say anything. It was a long time ago. It was an accident. my fault. Feeling far too exposed now on a million levels, Zoe took the coffee cup out of Max's hand and took it back to the kitchen, not caring that she was slopping coffee on her floor. Like I said, I have to work tomorrow. She came back into the living area and went to the front door, opening it. She avoided looking directly at Max, which wasn't the easiest thing when he took up so much space. Thank you for dropping me home. I take it you're asking me to leave. His tone was dry. She glanced at him, suddenly afraid that he wouldn't take no for an answer, even though instinctively she felt safe with him, which was something she didn't really want to analyze. But he didn't look angry. He appeared unconcerned that she was being so rude. She felt contrite. Yes, look sorry. It's been a long day. So why didn't she feel tired? Why did she feel as if she was full of fizzy anticipation and a breathlessness that was becoming far too familiar in his presence? Max looked at Zoe. She was tense again, reminding him of that fawn, ready to bolt. He walked towards her and saw how her hand tightened on the door handle. Okay, I can take a hint. I'll leave. But before I do, I want you to be honest with me. She looked up at him, and Max had to stop himself from staring at her soft mouth. What do you mean? You feel it too, don't you? This energy between us, chemistry, desire. Color spilled into her cheeks even as she shook her head. When she spoke, she sounded breathless, and it had a direct effect on Max's body. No, I don't. I don't think I do. Max smiled, because it was a long time since he'd had to seduce a woman. Liar. Now Zoe looked bewildered. Why are you interested in me? Why are you so suspicious? Because I'm just nothing special, and I'm not looking for compliments. I know, Max said. I'm just normal, nothing extraordinary. Your pictures aren't just normal. You have a talent, and you're beautiful. I want you, Zoe, more than I've wanted anyone in a long time. Her cheeks glowed. You're very direct. Has anyone ever told you that? A memory flashed into Max's head of his mother, her face contorted with fury, her hand coming out of nowhere to slap him across the cheek, her spittle hitting his face as she said, I owe you nothing. On a rare occasion, Max said dryly, pushing down that rogue memory of the time when he'd confronted his mother about her woeful mothering skills. Zoe looked up at Max Marchetti. She couldn't believe he just told her he wanted her. Her, boring, ordinary Zoe Collins. But he didn't think she was ordinary or boring. It was too seductive, too much. She could feel secret parts of herself that she'd exposed before wanting to unfurl and bask in this man's dynamic presence. Dangerous to want those things, because she'd wanted them before, and she paid for it. For her naivety, for her vulnerability. But, in truth, Dean Simpson hadn't really had the power to truly wound her. She'd had a lucky escape. Whereas this man, she sensed a level of danger that she would be wise to heed. He looked as immovable as a massive stone statue. But treacherously, in the same moment she could acknowledge the danger, she also felt it dissipating, to be replaced by temptation. Desperation gripped her at the thought that he might see how tempted she was. She needed to nip this in the bud now, prove to Max that he was delusional. Surely, if she could prove that he'd leave, and then she could get on with her life, and forget that she'd ever met him as, if you could forget a man like this, taunted an inner voice. It was a taunt that turned her desperation to panic. Panic strong enough to make her step closer to him and say, I'll prove to you that there's really nothing between us. Zoe knew he was issuing a challenge, but she had no option but to follow it through now. She sucked in a breath and stepped even closer. Max made no move to touch her. She reached up, putting her hands on his shoulders, coming up on her toes. He was so tall, so broad. Every part of her tingled with her awareness of him as a virile male in his prime. That had to be all it was. She was only human. It couldn't be desire uniquely for him. And he would soon realize that she really didn't hold any appeal for him. She reached up as much as she could, her hands gripping his shoulders, and pressed her mouth to his before she could lose her nerve. But the nerves, the sense of panic, the desire to prove him wrong, all was incinerated in a flash of electric heat as soon as her lips met the firm contours of his mouth. Zoe was vaguely aware that she'd intended this to be a quick physical transaction merely to prove Max Marchetti wrong. But she couldn't move, didn't want to. Her lips clung to his in a timeless moment when everything was suspended on a breath, which she finally let out like a sigh against his mouth. It was a sigh of resignation, a sigh of futility, a sigh of recognition that the hectic throbbing pulse of her blood wasn't just because she was a human reacting to a virile male. It was because something in her resonated so deeply with something in him that she would never be the same again. She could feel the sheer whipcord strength of his body, but she was still not close enough. She wanted to move against him. Let all that heat and strength envelop her. It was a taunt that turned her desperation to panic. Panic strong enough to make her step closer to him and say, "I'll prove to you that there's really nothing between us." Of their own volition her lips opened as if they literally couldn't bear to keep shut. Breath flowed. Her tongue tip moved forward, seeking to taste. But she had barely touched the seam of his mouth when she suddenly realized what she was doing and pulled back, as if stung. Max Marchetti was looking at her. She realized that she was still clinging to him, reaching up, straining to get closer. She pulled her hands off him and stepped back so suddenly she almost fell. Her cheeks burned. She ducked her head and let her hair fall around her face. She was terrified to look at him again and see his expression, terrified to get confirmation of what she'd set out to prove, that he couldn't possibly want her. She'd failed miserably in proving she didn't want him, though. She'd been clinging to him like a monkey, and she was sure he'd only been seconds away from having to physically remove her. "Zoe, I can practically hear your thoughts. They're so loud." She looked up before she could stop herself. His eyes were glittering, almost silver now. His mouth was quirking. This was even worse. He was laughing at her. Zoe stalked over to the door and pulled it open. She didn't look at him again. "I think you should leave now." He came over, and the door was pushed closed again. But Max was still in the room. Zoe looked at him. He was shaking his head. No quirking mouth now. Deadly serious. He reached out and tucked a lock of her hair behind her ear. And then he moved closer. The air grew thick and heavy. His hand was still in her hair. He said, "May I?" Zoe's heart beat fast. He hadn't left. He wasn't laughing at her. He was looking at her mouth, as if mesmerized, and now at her eyes. She had nowhere to hide. She just nodded. He made a total mockery of her clumsy kiss by taking her face in his hands and tilting it up to his with an assurance born of experience and mastery. She could feel the rough abrasion of his palms and fingers against her jaw and cheeks. Rough, not smooth. Evidence that he wasn't as civilized as he looked. His mouth touched hers, lightly at first, as if testing. Zoe held her breath, afraid to move in case he stopped. Their breaths intermingled. He kissed the corner of her mouth, taking her by surprise, and then the other corner, where the scar dissected her lip. Her legs felt weak. She had to lock her knees to stay standing. And then his mouth settled over hers completely, and she had to close her eyes against the burning intensity in his for fear that he might see the effect he was having on her. His mouth was hard, but soft, coaxing a response that she couldn't hold back, giving it as instinctively as a flower gave itself to the power of the sun. She opened her mouth on a sigh that turned into a shiver of excitement when Max's tongue touched hers, demanding more, demanding everything. Zoe had been kissed before. She'd even enjoyed it, until she hadn't. But this went beyond mere enjoyment. This was elemental, a conflagration burning her up from the inside out, leaving no cell untouched or unscorched. It was a taunt that turned her desperation to panic. Panic strong enough to make her step closer to him and say, "I'll prove to you that there's really nothing between us." Time faded away. All she was aware of was the hectic beat of her heart and the pounding of her blood. She strained to get closer to Max, winding her arms around his neck, and then he broke the kiss. Zoe opened her eyes with effort. She was dizzy. She realized she was all but plastered to Max, and that his hands were on her waist, helping to support her. Her breath was choppy. Shakily, she took her arms down and moved aside, dislodging Max's hands. "I think that's proved the point," he said. Her brain felt sluggish. She felt undone. The point? That there's chemistry between us. Was that what it was called? Zoe's whole body was throbbing. She wanted Max to kiss her again, to stop talking. She knew she didn't want to think about what was happening here, because that would be way too scary. He took a step back. Her belly lurched. "Where are you going? You want me to stay?" "I." She stopped. For a moment she'd almost said yes, and as the full realization of that sank in, how quickly she'd forgotten what had happened the last time she'd allowed a man close. Sanity cooled her heated brain. "No, I don't want you to stay. Even if you said yes, I'd still leave." So looked at him. She was surprised, and not liking the little voice that whispered inside her head, "He's different. This is different." "Why?" Max took a step closer again. "Because I can see that you're not ready. You're skittish. Something has happened to you. You don't trust me." It took a few seconds for Zoe to absorb that, and when she did his words landed in her belly like a cold stone. "Something has happened to you. You don't trust me." She felt totally exposed now, in a way that she promised herself she wouldn't ever again. Zoe folded her arms. "You think you see a lot, Mr. Marchetti." He smiled, but it was rueful. "I'm good at reading people, a lesson I learned at the hands of selfish and self-absorbed parents." She didn't want to know that about him. She didn't want to think of him and his sister dealing with their parents' bitter divorce. She went to the door and opened it. She turned around. "Why would I do that?" Max said from behind her, "Give me your phone. Because this doesn't end here, but I'm going to leave the ball in your court." Torn between wanting to shut down that arrogance and wanting to know what he meant to do, Zoe made a huffing sound and then went to her backpack and pulled out her phone. She handed it to Max, who took it and punched in some numbers. He handed it back, and somehow she resisted the urge to check it. There was something about his confidence that was as irritating as it was seductive. He went to the door. She felt that lurch again, as if something very primal inside her objected to him leaving. She walked over. He was already on the other side of the door. "I look forward to hearing from you," he said. So held on to the door. "You might not hear from me at all." He looked at her for a long moment. "I think I will, and then you'll tell me what happened to you." The thought of telling him of her humiliation made her go cold. It helped her to stiffen her spine and say, "Goodbye, Max." He shook his head as he backed away, his mouth quirking up. "Ciao, Zoe." He turned, and he disappeared down the stairs before she could say anything else. She closed the door only after she'd heard the door close downstairs, and then the powerful throttle of his car's engine. She got ready for bed in a bit of a stupor, still slightly stunned at everything that had happened this evening. She'd lost her job. In fairness, it hadn't exactly been her main source of income. Truth be told, she didn't have a main source of income. She was an expert in doing lots of things and committing to none, not even photography, because committing to something meant showing some kind of vulnerability, risking a massive fail or, worse, pain and loss. Zoe scowled at herself in the small bathroom mirror, and that was why she didn't need to invite a man like Max Marchetti into her life, because he saw too much, and he made her feel too much, and not just physically. That impulse, she'd had to ask him to stay scared her even now. It had been so immediate, visceral, and he was a stranger. But you want him in a way that's different. She clamped down on painful memories. She'd confused desire with being able to trust someone before, but that kiss had blown any kind of understanding of desire she'd had before out of the water. What she'd experienced had been child's play. This was the real deal. Earthy, raw, out of control. She knew instinctively that Max Marchetti was a man who would demand nothing less than total surrender, and that was something Zoe couldn't imagine giving to anyone. It would ask too much of her. She looked at herself critically. Pajamas buttoned up to the neck, face scrubbed so clean that her scars stood out in pink lines, superficial scars that hid far deeper scars. Max Marchetti would soon forget all about a woman who had intrigued him just for a moment. She wouldn't be using his number, and he wouldn't be knocking on her door again. What? Max growled at his assistant without turning around from where he stood at the window of his London office. The city was spread out before him, with the Thames snaking between iconic buildings and under even more iconic bridges, but Max couldn't have cared less. All that had consumed him for a week now was, why the hell hasn't she got in touch with me? Zoe Collins, the woman he'd shared probably the most chaste kiss of his life with, and yet it had left an erotic imprint that lingered in his blood, waking him every night with his body aching for sexual fulfillment. Boss, it's the fact that you're meant to be overseeing that shoot in New York at the moment. Max turned around to face the young man. He arched a brow. And clearly I'm not, because he was loath to leave London in case she called, when he never normally made decisions based on a lover who wasn't even a lover. Yet, the thought that she might never be a lover evoked an almost violent reaction inside him. He would know her. They've decided to reschedule and relocate to St. Petersburg in the hope that you can attend while you're there for your meetings. Max should feel slightly chastened by the fact that one of the world's biggest fashion houses cared enough about his opinion to reschedule an advertising campaign to suit his schedule, but he didn't. He was filled with a sense of resolve. Tell them I'll be there, and I won't be alone. No matter how he had to do it, he would have Zoe Collins by his side and in his bed. Zoe packed her bag as the people left the classroom. One of the young women turned around at the door and came back, surprising Zoe with an impromptu hug. Zoe hugged her back and smiled. What's that for? Just to say thank you. You don't know how much it means, you helping us find our way in this new life. Zoe blushed, embarrassed. Don't be daft. If I wasn't here, someone else would be. The girl shook her head. She was serious. Too serious. She'd seen awful things. She'd lost her entire family. Maybe, Miss Collins, but you are the one here, helping us, so thank you. Zoe's heart constricted as she watched the young woman in the headscarf walk out. She couldn't imagine not being here to help these people. Teaching English to newly arrived immigrants was such a basic thing, and the sense of reward she got from it made her feel guilty enough that she was happy it was on a voluntary basis. She was about to leave when her mobile phone pinged with a message. She frowned and picked it out of her bag. Not having close family or friends meant that she wasn't used to receiving the casual messages everyone else took for granted. She unlocked her phone to see a text from. Her heart stopped. Him. "Hi, Zoe." She texted back. "How do you have my number?" "I made sure I called myself from your phone when I put in my number, so I knew I'd have it." Zoe's heart was palpitating. All week he'd haunted her waking and sleeping moments. A dozen times she'd almost deleted his number and then stopped herself at the last moment. She typed back, "I would have called you if I was interested." So wanted to scowl, but it turned into a grudging smile. She couldn't deny the rush of excitement, and also a treacherous sense of relief. Before she could think of how to respond to that, he sent another text. "I'm outside, waiting for you. Interesting place." So nearly dropped her phone. She looked up, suddenly terrified he'd be lounging in the doorway, smirking at her. But it was empty. He could hardly mean. She walked out of the room with her bag, down the corridor of the local community center. Not the prettiest building in the world, by any stretch of the imagination, and certainly not the kind of place for a man like. He was here. Zoe stepped outside the main doors to see Max Marchetti, lounging against the same low-slung car he'd been driving a week ago, except this time he was dressed more casually, wearing dark trousers and a dark gray long-sleeved top. She didn't have to inspect it to guess that it was probably cashmere, and it clung to his muscles far too lovingly, leaving little to the imagination. Zoe felt self-conscious in her worn jeans and T-shirt, worn under an even more worn V-necked jumper, scuffed trainers. She walked over. "What are you doing here?" She sounded accusing and winced inwardly. This man precipitated extreme reactions in her. "I got bored waiting for you to call and sought you out. You'd mentioned teaching English, and it wasn't hard to find out where some local classes were listed." Zoe hated to admit that she was impressed. "You could have just called me." He shrugged. "It wouldn't have been as much fun." She looked around the very ordinary car park in disbelief. "As much fun as visiting East London again. You need to get out more." Max chuckled. "Perhaps I do." He stood up straight, reminding Zoe how tall he was, how powerful, how that mouth had felt on hers, hot. A wave of desire made her legs feel momentarily weak. "I've been invited to the opening of a photography exhibition this evening. I thought you might like to come with me." Zoe hadn't expected him to say that. Curiosity got the better of her. "What exhibition?" "Taylor Cartwright's latest work." Zoe sucked in a breath at this mention of one of America's foremost landscape photographers who had died recently, and said, almost to herself, "It's been sold out for months. Would you like to come?" She was torn between jumping at the opportunity and her wariness at the thought of spending more time with a man who made her skin prickle with heat and a million other disturbing things. Zoe looked at him suspiciously. "And after the exhibition? Then what?" "That's up to you. I'd like to take you for dinner, maybe a drink, or I can drop you home." Remembering that kiss, Zoe said quickly, "I can make my own way home." "Whatever you wish." It was a taunt that turned her desperation to panic. Panic strong enough to make her step closer to him and say, "I'll prove to you that there's really nothing between us." Max looked at the woman in front of him. If his blood hadn't been humming just from being near her again, he might have wondered why she had such a unique effect on him. But he wasn't capable of wondering about anything right now. He felt as if he'd scored a victory merely because she hadn't said no, and because she hadn't ruled out dinner or a drink. The fact that he hadn't had to work so hard to seduce a woman ever was also not something he cared to think about right now. So couldn't have been less dressed to impress, but all he could see were those huge aquamarine eyes. Her hair was down, which he was guessing was her default, so she could hide behind it if she wanted to. It made him want to pull it back, so he could see her face more clearly. He barely noticed her scars. He was more distracted by her soft lips, and the erotic memory of how they'd opened under his mouth, the taste of her. He cursed silently when his body responded, "Okay, I'd like to come, thank you." Max almost didn't hear her. He was trying so hard to get his body under control. Good. That's good. So made a face, and she suddenly looked shy. "Would you mind if I stopped by my flat to change, though? Just for 5 minutes." A couple of hours later, he was wondering why he'd been surprised when Zoe literally had only been in her flat for 5 minutes before re-emerging. Max shook his head. Of course not. Let's go. He looked at her across the gallery. She changed into figure-hugging leather trousers and a soft V-necked cream sweater under a dark gray jacket. Clothes designed not to draw attention, to blend in, like the way she used that fall honey blonde hair to hide her face most of the time. She had a tomboyish style that made him want to see her dressed in long falls of silk and satin that would cling to her body and reveal those slender curves, that pale skin. She was staring intently at a large photograph of Yosemite, the national park in America. His mouth thinned. Another first, a woman who wasn't utterly absorbed with him, either feigning it or otherwise. As if reading his mind, the woman beside him said, "I like her already. She's not clinging to your arm as if she can't walk by herself, or simpering about the latest nail varnish colors." Max looked at his sister and said dryly, "Sash, if I wasn't so emotionally barren, you could really hurt me sometimes." His sister snorted derisively, but Max ignored her. It had been a bad idea to ask her to come. She was too astute for her own good, so knew she couldn't keep pretending that the photos held more fascination for her than the man she could see behind her through the crowd, reflected in the glass over the black and white image. He was talking to a woman, tall, slim. A dart of something hit Zoe in the solar plexus, a jolt of possessiveness, which was ridiculous. They'd kissed once. He was obviously only interested because she wasn't falling into his arms like an overripe plum. Steeling herself, Zoe turned around and walked back over towards Max, whose dark gray gaze was unnervingly intent on her. It was a taunt that turned her desperation to panic. Panic strong enough to make her step closer to him and say, "I'll prove to you that there's really nothing between us." She took in the woman beside him. Something about her was familiar, but she knew she'd never seen her before. She was wearing nondescript clothes, a shirt and long skirt, as if she was trying to hide. Long hair, dark blonde, and she wore glasses. But Zoe realized that woman was extraordinarily beautiful. Zoe watched her walk away, fading into the crowd. She turned to Max. "You didn't have to send her away." Max took her arm. "Oh, yes, I did. She was bound to embarrass me. It's her life's mission." Zoe's heart clenched. She'd had a younger brother. He would have been 23. Would he have ribbed her like Sasha did Max? Her heart ached. Max was looking down at her, ready to go. Zoe nodded quickly, afraid he'd see the sudden melancholy in her eyes. She worked so hard not to think of those things. Thank you for this. I enjoyed seeing the photos. It was a taunt that turned her desperation to panic. Panic strong enough to make her step closer to him and say, I'll prove to you that there's really nothing between us. She didn't mention that Taylor Cartwright had been a mentor of her father's when he'd been young, traveling around North America and taking his first photographs. Max led her out of the gallery onto the street. Summer was tipping into autumn, and there was the faintest chill in the evening air, a sign of things to come. Zoe shivered slightly. Immediately Max said, Are you cold? His solicitude melted the cold around her heart. She shook her head. No, I'm fine. So, can I take you for dinner? There's a place not far from here. Seeing Max with his sister and touching on the past again had made Zoe feel vulnerable. She didn't want to be alone, but she knew that was just an excuse. She looked up at Max. Sure, I'd like that. He smiled, and like his sister, it transformed his face, turning him from gorgeous into devastating. He took her hand and led her to his car. She found that her usual anxiety around being in a car didn't surface when she was with him. He drove so competently, not trying to show off. He didn't need to. He oozed confidence. Within 10 minutes, Max was driving down a quiet new street. Zoe frowned. Where are we? Mayfair. He pulled to a stop outside one of the houses. It had dark brick and black framed windows. It looked discreet and exclusive. She wondered if this was another private club. As if reading her mind, Max said, This is my London townhouse. So looked at him. She opened her mouth, but then she realized that he hadn't actually specified where he was bringing her. He just said, There's a place. That's rather underhand of you. I promise my intentions are very honorable. If you feel uncomfortable in any way, I'll take you wherever you want to go. He made a crossing his heart motion. Zoe didn't trust him for a second, but it was more that she didn't trust herself, if she was totally honest. She unclicked her seatbelt and watched as Max uncoiled his tall frame from the driver's seat to come round and help her out. She was more intrigued than she liked to admit to see where he lived. The door opened as Max approached as if by magic. A middle-aged Asian man dressed in dark trousers and dark long-sleeved top greeted Max. Hamish, I'd like you to meet Zoe Collins. The man stepped forward at the door, smiling and holding out his hand. You're probably wondering how I came by a name like Hamish. I was born and brought up in Scotland when my parents emigrated there from Vietnam. I'm Max's housekeeping manager. Please, come in. Zoe was charmed by him and his soft Scottish burr. Nice to meet you, Hamish. She walked into a sleek marbled hallway, decorated in tones of dark gray and silver, understated, elegant. She heard Hamish say, I'll park the car, boss. Angie said dinner will be ready in about 20 minutes. Thanks, Hamish. Max came and took Zoe's hand again. She must have looked dumbstruck. He led her down the hall and into a sumptuous but again understated reception room. He let her hand go and walked over to an exquisite walnut drinks cabinet. It looked like a piece of art, not furniture. Would you like a drink? Suddenly Zoe relished the prospect of some fortification. A glass of white wine, if you have it? Max came back with a glass of perfectly chilled white wine. He had a tumbler of what looked like whiskey. He lifted his glass. Cheers. Welcome to my home. Cheers. Zoe took a sip of wine, appreciating the dry, crisp taste. Please, sit, make yourself comfortable. So looked around. There was an assortment of low couches and footstools set around glass tables covered in the latest coffee table hardbacks. Except these actually looked as if they'd been thumbed through, their edges slightly frayed. She chose a seat on its own and watched as Max sat down on a couch at a right angle to her, resting one arm along the back, utterly relaxed, yet full of taut, crackling energy. "You have a beautiful home," she said. Max looked around. "It's probably not what you were expecting." Dan his perceptiveness. "I'm that easy to read?" she asked. "It's refreshing. I'm used to people freezing their emotions with enough chemicals to put an animal to sleep for a year." So couldn't stop a huff of laughter. "I have to admit I would have expected something less discreet. Maybe a penthouse apartment." Max made a face. "That's more my brother Sharif's style. He likes to be far above mere mortals, high in the sky." So took a sip of wine. "What's he like?" "Driven." "What about your other brother, Nikos?" "He used to live like a nomad, keeping apartments in our various hotels. But all that looks to change now that he's married and settling down. A wife and baby don't really go with a nomadic lifestyle." So's insides tightened. Marriage, a baby, family, her worst fear, her most secret dream. She shut it down. She'd vowed never to put herself at risk of feeling that loss and pain again, no matter what moments of yearning she felt. Max swirled his drink. "What about you? What kind of home would you aspire to live in?" So felt like pointing out tartly that she was perfectly happy where she was, but she knew no one could claim that. It was damp, dingy, and surrounded by concrete jungle. But before she could say anything, she was assailed by the memory of a house in Ireland, Dublin, on the coast, high above the Irish Sea, with acres of green lawn. A big golden house with windows like shining, benevolent eyes, flowers blooming along borders, a shaggy dog. Our mother, standing on the steps, calling, "Come on, you two, it's time to go," and then her father, lifting her up so high she could hardly breathe, swinging her around and then down into his arms. She'd felt so safe, so loved, so happy. "So, are you okay?" She blinked and saw Max sitting forward, frowning. "You've gone as white as a ghost." So swallowed down the memory. It usually only came in dreams that turned into nightmares. "I'm fine. I just—" What had they been talking about? She forced a smile. "I don't know where I'd like to live. I hadn't really thought about it. I'm happy where I am." Max was relieved to see some color come back into Zoe's cheeks. For a moment he'd been afraid she was about faint. She'd looked stricken. A light knock came to the door. It was Hamish. "Dinner is served when you're ready." Max watched Zoe stand up, graceful. She walked out ahead of him, following Hamish, and he noted the unconsciously sensual way she moved. A cynical part of his brain kicked into gear. Was it really unconscious? Or was he so jaded that an act of wide-eyed innocence had him hooked like a gasping fish on a line? Even if it was an act, he told himself, it didn't negate the fact that he wanted her more with each passing moment. And he was confident that as soon as he'd had her, she'd lose her allure and her air of mystery. He didn't want to explore her mysteries. He just wanted to explore her. So he leaned back and wiped her mouth with her napkin. She hadn't eaten such a delicious meal in a long time. Max's personal chef, Angie, had served up a simple roast chicken and in-season vegetables, followed by the lightest, zingiest lemon tart Zoe had ever tasted. Angie came back in to clear the plate and Zoe looked at her. Seriously, that was sublime. I wish I could cook like that. Angie smiled and looked at Max. I like her. She doesn't behave as if the staff are invisible. Max sent a glower at Angie, who left the room smiling, totally unperturbed. Witnessing Max's easy and egalitarian interaction with his staff made Zoe feel off-center. Once again, it wasn't the way she would have expected someone like him to behave. Max stood up. Come into the lounge for some coffee. Zoe stood up. Sure. Dinner had passed easily, too easily. They conversed about topics as diverse as Irish history, politics, and the latest Marvel movie. It turned out they were both Marvel movie buffs, but there was still an uneasiness she couldn't shake. She trusted a man before, someone she'd known since she was young, and he'd betrayed her heinously and almost violently. She knew even less about Max, and yet her instincts were telling her she could trust him, that he wouldn't harm her physically. Dean had hurt her physically, or had tried to, but he hadn't left any deep emotional wounds. Zoe sensed that Max posed a wholly different threat. What are you thinking about? Zoe turned around from where she'd been looking at the books on Max's shelves, with her coffee cup in her hand. He was sitting on the couch again, sipping from his own steaming cup, looking so gorgeous that he took her breath away. She came over and sat down on a couch opposite, with a small table in between them. She noted how a gleam came into those silver eyes, as if he knew exactly how skittish he made her feel. How aggy, how needy, but also how scared. Max kept his eyes on her and put down his cup. He stood up and came around the low table, sat down on the couch near her. Then he was pulling up her top and exposing both breasts to his hands, his mouth. Zoe's head rolled back. His thigh was between her legs, where she ached. As if he knew exactly what she wanted, he moved subtly, so that the sensation spiked like a sharp knife point. It was too much. She couldn't get her head around how fast things were moving. In spite of all her rationale, telling herself this was different, way different from what had happened before, she suddenly felt trapped, very aware of Max's weight on top of her, holding her down. She put her hands against his chest and pushed, but he didn't move. Panic flared, eclipsing pleasure. She pushed harder. Max pulled back, his eyes molten, cheeks flushed. "Che cosa, cara?" He wasn't even talking English. Panic was making Zoe fight for breath. I can't breathe." Max reared back. "So? What is it?" She scrambled up and back, drawing her knees up to her chest. She shook her head. Already the waves of panic were receding, leaving her feeling cold and ridiculous. This wasn't the same situation. I'm sorry. It was just all going so fast. I felt trapped." In contrast to hers, Max's clothes looked a bit rumpled, but were still on. She felt disheveled. Awkwardly, she straightened her clothes. Max got up and went over to the drinks cabinet. He came back holding 2 glasses. He handed her one. It held dark golden liquid. "Here, take this." She took a sip, watching as he threw the liquid in his own glass back. She winced inwardly. The drink had a warming, numbing effect. He sat down, giving her plenty of space. "What was that, Zoe?" Max looked pale. "Did you think I was going to force you?" She shook her head, an immediate and visceral rejection of that rising up inside her. No, not at all. She couldn't think straight when he was looking at her like that. She put down her glass and got up from the couch, pacing away from Max, walking to a window that reflected back her own image. It was dark outside. She owed him an explanation. At no point had she really felt unsafe or pressured. It had been her own demons. She turned around. Someone else did, though. My ex-boyfriend. I trusted him and he. Max surged to his feet. He raped you. So looked at Max. His face was stark. She shook her head. No, but he almost did. I managed to stop him, get him out of my apartment. The memory of that awful night made Zoe shiver. The awful, full, ugly truth of why Dean had sought her out again. Who was he? Max's voice was like steel. In that moment, she had a premonition of what it would be like to face a far less benign Max. She faced him once before, when they'd first met. Someone from my past. It doesn't matter. He's gone now. He's not in this country. Max was finding it hard to absorb everything Zoe was telling him. She looked so vulnerable, standing on her own, arms folded tight across her chest. The thought of someone forcing themselves on her made him feel sick, but also livid. She was so petite, slight. He wanted to go over to her, but he felt she wouldn't want that. Not yet. She lifted her chin. The truth is that, as you may have already guessed, I'm not that experienced. In fact, not experienced at all. I'm a virgin, yes. Max frowned. Are you saying that? Her words were quick, clipped. His instinct had been right. A swell of something that felt like possessiveness rose up inside him, primal, mine, and relieved to know she hadn't been subjected to a terrible assault. She said, so I know that that'll probably change things. Max focused on Zoe. Change? How? She suddenly looked unsure. Well, you want. You can't find that attractive. Max's body begged to differ. Really? And why would that be? Because you're experienced and I'm not. Most men don't find inexperienced women a turn on. I'm not most men. Now Max folded his arms, bristling at the thought that she was comparing him to her ex. Her bullying, abusive ex. He could see her throat work as she swallowed. So, what are you saying? She asked. Yes, Max, what are you saying? That you want to be this woman's first lover and risk all the emotional entanglements that come with that. Max forced the heat haze out of his brain. He had to be careful. He normally steered well clear of situations like this. He had to let Zoe know the kind of person he was. I'm saying that you being a virgin is not a turn-off. Quite the opposite, in fact. The thought of being the first man to witness Zoe in the throes of passion was seriously sexy. But, he added carefully, I'm not interested in a relationship. I don't do happy ever afters. And after my experience with my parents, I have no desire to recreate that toxic scenario in marriage. You need to know that. So looked at him for a long moment. There was no discernible expression on her face, which unnerved him. He believed her to be as easy to read as a book. She seemed to hug her arms around herself even tighter, and she said, That's the last thing I'm looking for. Believe me. He did. There was something stripped away in her voice, leaving it bare and compelling. Then she said, I think I'd like to go home now. Max was surprised at the strength of the feeling of rejection that rose up inside him at the thought of her leaving. But he forced himself to say, Sure. I take you home, but I'm over the limit. I'll have Hamish drop you back. The fact that Max was willing to let her leave so easily made Zoe feel all at once relieved and disappointed. She just humiliated herself spectacularly by revealing she'd been abused in a relationship, and then told Max how inexperienced she was. And damn him, he hadn't reacted the way she might have expected. She was learning that this man didn't do anything she expected, but the fact that he was so willing to let her go told her that he was done. As he'd said, he didn't do relationships. and he obviously suspected that, as a virgin, she'd want more from her first lover, even though she denied it. Zoe just wanted to leave now and take her humiliation with her. She was about to protest that she didn't need a lift, but, as if connected with his boss telepathically, Hamish appeared and started to put on a light puffer jacket. She couldn't help feeling that Hamish had done this before, sprung into action to help Max dispose of a woman he was no longer interested in. She followed Hamish and turned at the front door to face Max. She felt awkward. Why had she blurted all that out? She could have made something up. "It's no problem to give you a lift home, Zoe." She forced a smile in Max's general direction. "Thank you for this evening. I had a nice time. It was lovely to meet your sister. She's nice. She liked you too. Good night, Zoe." Zoe had to restrain an impulse to study his face and imprint it on her brain forever. And somehow she knew she didn't need to do that. He would be hard to forget. After Hamish had dropped her at her flat, Zoe sat on her bed feeling deflated, hollow. She opened up her laptop and did what she'd been reluctant to do before, because that would have meant she was interested. She searched online for Max Marchetti. As she might have expected, compared to his two brothers, not much came up for Max at all. There was a handful of pictures of him with women, all stunningly beautiful and accomplished, which made his interest in Zoe even more unlikely. There were no salacious kiss and tell stories, unlike a recent one involving his older brother Sharif. Nor were there screaming headlines as there were about his other brother settling down, speculating about how long it would last. Zoe saw some pictures of Nikos with his new wife. She was a tall redhead, and Zoe realized that she looked familiar. She was the woman Max had been talking to at the fashion event where she'd met him again. She shuddered to think of being in the public eye like that, and felt sympathy for Nikos's wife, who didn't look completely comfortable in the photos. There were some older pictures of his parents. His father was tall and dark, very masculine. His mother was tall, almost taller than his father, and very, very beautiful, blonde with gray eyes. Max's gray eyes. Zoe winced when she saw the hundreds of images of Max and Sasha when they were younger, coming out of a palatial villa in Rome, going to school with security guards, skiing, on beaches. Nowhere had been safe from the paparazzi, it would seem. One picture caught Zoe's eye. Max was in swimming trunks on a beach. He looked about 16, tall and rangy, his body only hinting at the adult power and strength to come. He had his hand out towards whoever was taking the picture, his face twisted in anger. Zoe saw there was a girl behind him, looking fearful, embarrassed, in a one-piece swimsuit, all gangly limbs and braces on her teeth. She looked hunted. Sasha. No wonder he hated the paparazzi so much. But compared to his brothers and his parents, Max had since become a veritable recluse. Evidently he and his sister did all they could to avoid the limelight now, and who could blame them if they'd been hounded like that? So pushed the laptop away and lay back on her bed. She'd effectively turned Max off tonight, even if he had been enough of a gentleman to say otherwise. She told herself she was relieved. Max was a force of nature, a man who would demand nothing less than everything she had to give. Yet she couldn't ignore the ache at the thought of never seeing him again. So realized now that she'd never been entirely honest with herself where her ex-boyfriend was concerned. She'd convinced herself that she desired him, but it hadn't been desire, because now she knew how that felt. It had been loneliness, pure and simple, unprecedented, raw, insatiable, but just desire, a chemical reaction, not emotion. He heard a sound behind him and turned around. She changed into cropped jeans and a fresh shirt, her scuffed trainers, hair down, minimal makeup. She looked young and fresh and etchingly beautiful, without even trying. She was holding her camera and lifted it up. I might go out and take some pictures. You probably have meetings to attend. Her dogged independence made Max chafe, when he usually abhorred a lover trying to monopolize his attention. Something rogue inside him made him say, "Actually, I'm not under pressure today. I'll come with you." So couldn't stop the rush of pleasure, even though a moment ago she'd actually been relishing the thought of some space from Max. He saw too much, and he made her feel too much, but now she felt as giddy as a kid again. "Are you sure? Unless you don't want me to come with you." Zoe just managed to refrain from rolling her eyes at that suggestion. "No, I'd like it." Several hours later, Zoe was drunk again, but not on anything more than Venice, some pasta followed by gelato, and Max. He absolutely belonged in this milieu, against the dramatically beautiful backdrop of such an ancient and iconic city. She'd taken a sneaky snap of him on a bridge, and she'd bet money that he'd been a Venetian prince in another lifetime, albeit one in faded jeans that were molded to his powerful thighs and taut behind, and a dark polo shirt that did little to disguise the lean musculature of his chest, and aviator glasses that made him look like he just stepped out of Vogue Italia for men. Zoe sighed. Whatever anomalous moment or thing had led to Max finding her attractive, she was sure it wouldn't last for much longer. He turned to her and held out his hand, and Zoe's heart constricted. She was in so much trouble. As she took his hand and let him lead her into the labyrinthine streets, she knew that against all her best intentions and instincts she'd done the thing that she feared most in the world. She'd fallen in love with Max, and she knew now that whatever she believed she felt for Dean had been nothing in comparison. Less than nothing. It had been driven by loneliness and the fact that she'd known him from her past. This had nothing to do with loneliness or weakness. It was wild, untamable, and elemental, and she knew that whatever pain she felt before, even when she'd lost her entire family, would pale into insignificance compared to what Max would do to her, and she was afraid it was already too late. Max looked at Zoe where she stood in the small osteria near one of Venice's many bridges. She sipped at a small aperitif. He noticed men looking at her and instinctively moved closer. He'd never felt possessive before, so looked up at him. "What was the house that you grew up in like?" Max thought of her evocative description of watching storms rolling in over the sea and felt wistful. "Not like yours. No view of the sea. It was a grand palazzo in Rome. Beautiful, but austere. We weren't allowed to touch things because they were all priceless antiques. Once Sasha and I were playing, and she knocked over a vase. I'm pretty sure it was Ming." Zoe put a hand over her mouth, eyes wide, sparkling. "Our father came out of his study and saw it. He took off his leather belt and asked who was responsible." Zoe's hand came down from her mouth. Now she looked horrified. Sasha stepped forward. She was 9. I think she thought he wouldn't dare, if he knew it had been her fault. But I knew my father by then. I knew what he was capable of. So I pushed her behind me and told him I had done it. He beat you with the belt. Max pulled down the collar of his polo shirt, and Zoe looked at where he was pointing, to a faded scar just over his collarbone, a rough ridge of skin. She reached up and touched it. Her finger was feather-light against his skin, yet it burned. She frowned. "I didn't notice it before." She sounded almost angry with herself that she hadn't. Max swallowed. My father stopped when I grabbed the belt off him and started to hit him. I was 14 by then, and almost as tall as him. He didn't do it again. Zoe took her hand down, and Max missed her touch. She asked, "How did you know he would be capable of hitting a young girl?" Max's insides felt like lead, because I'd seen him hit one of our young maids, and I'd seen him hit our mother when I was much younger, before they divorced. "I'm sorry you experienced that." Max took her hand back and kissed her fingers, relishing their coolness. "I think I would have liked your house." Zoe smiled, but it was sad. I never saw it again after the crash. It was dealt with by lawyers and the state. They offered to let me go back and get my things, but I couldn't bear to. Everything was put in storage for me, but I've never visited the storage unit. She shrugged and looked down. I'm a bit of a coward. Max's chest felt tight. He tipped up her chin and saw her eyes were like two oceans of green and blue. "You're not a coward, Zoe. Far from it." Zoe looked up at Max. He should be the hardest person in the world to talk to, but things that she never spoke of to anyone tripped off her tongue with an ease that shocked her. He threw back the rest of his aperitif and said, "Come on, let's go." Go where? Zoe didn't even want to ask, not wanting to burst the incredible bubble of being with this man in this beautiful place. She felt like a miser, wanting to hoard every tiny moment. After turning a dizzying number of corners, they emerged into a small quiet square with a large ornate church at one end. Max was leading her through to another street when she heard it, the sound of singing. Zoe stopped. She walked over to have a closer look. Posters advertised an opera, due to take place the following evening. The singing was more audible now, coming from inside, and she looked at Max, who shrugged and followed her into the dark interior. People were up on a stage in costume, but no makeup. She whispered to Max, "It must be the dress rehearsal. Can we stay a while?" He nodded. She was about to sit down at the back, but Max grabbed her hand and led her up a flight of narrow winding stairs. They came out onto a balcony on the upper level that had a view of the whole church and stage. They were rehearsing one of Zoe's favorite operas, La Traviata. The music swelled and washed over and through her. She was captivated, but not captivated enough to be oblivious to Max beside her. His long legs stretched out carelessly. The opera company stopped for a break. Zoe sighed as the echo of the music lingered in the church walls and rafters. She glanced at Max, who was looking at her and smiling. She felt wary. "What?" He snaked a hand to the back of her neck and tugged her towards him. "You constantly surprise me. They'll be coming here tomorrow in ball gowns and tuxedos. But I think you prefer this, don't you?" He saw her. Damn him. She nodded. He pulled her closer and pressed his mouth to hers. The fire ignited instantly, voraciously. It was only a discreet but forceful cough that made them pull apart. A priest was standing in the aisle below the balcony, looking up. So went puce. Max raised a hand to indicate that they were leaving. When they got outside, Zoe broke into a fit of giggles. Max caught her, and her giggles stopped abruptly when he kissed her again, stealing her sanity, stealing her soul. He stopped the kiss. "Let's go back to the hotel." Zoe nodded. She couldn't speak. He led her down to the canal, and they took a gondola. As they entered the Grand Canal from a smaller one, the sun was setting behind the huge palazzos and bathing everything in a rosy golden light. It was so beautiful that Zoe's breath caught. She lifted her camera, even though she knew that to try and capture it would fail miserably. But she needed to have some record of this moment, even if it would be infinitely inferior, because she knew it wouldn't happen again. When they arrived back at the hotel, Max barely acknowledged the manager, who leaped to attention. Zoe shot him an apologetic smile as Max pulled her into the elevator with indecent haste. As soon as they got to the suite, he closed the door and looked at Zoe. For a charged moment, neither one moved. Zoe had no idea who moved first, but she was in Max's arms, her legs wrapped around his waist, her mouth on every bit of exposed skin she could find as he walked them into the massive bedroom. The French doors were open and the curtains moved gently in the warm evening air. But Zoe was oblivious to everything but the spectacle of Max's body being revealed, inch by delicious inch, as he stripped off his clothes until he was naked. Now you... He started undoing her shirt, pushing it open, pulling the lace cups of her bra down so he could cup her breasts and push her nipples into pouting peaks, begging for his hot mouth. Zoe clasped his head in her hands as his wicked mouth tended to her sensitive flesh, his hot tongue leaving a trail of fire. Her shirt and bra were dispensed with, shoes kicked off, trousers opened and pulled down, underwear ripped. She didn't care. She just craved contact. Mutual desperation fueled their movements, and they took a simultaneous breath of relief when Max entered her on a smooth thrust. But the relief was soon replaced with urgency as the tension built and built, until Zoe was begging incoherently for Max to release them both. And even though she'd been begging for it, when it came she still wasn't ready. She was tossed high, and then fell deep down into a whirlpool of pleasure so intense that she couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, could only hold on as the storm racked Max's body too, and only then the tumult subsided. Max slumped over her body, still embedded deeply, and Zoe wrapped her legs around him and wished that this moment would never end. When Max woke, the bedroom was filled with the pearlescent light of dawn. He felt drunk, but it wasn't from alcohol. It was from an overload of sensual pleasure. Zoe lay curled into his side, one arm thrown over his chest and one leg over his thigh, her foot locked behind his knee, as if to stop him from going anywhere. He extricated himself carefully from her embrace, the nerve ends in his body firing to life as he touched the plump curve of one breast and felt the indentation of her waist, one silky thigh. She curled up on her side, saying something in her sleep. Max pulled a sheet over her. She was adorably slow to get going in the morning, sleepy and sexy. Naked, he went to the open window and stood there for a moment, relishing the cool morning breeze on his overheated skin. He felt utterly sated, and yet a delicious tendril of anticipation coiled in his gut. He heard movement behind him and looked around, a smile curving his mouth, his blood already heating at the thought of waking Zoe up in a very explicit click. She was sitting up in bed, and she had her camera lifted to her face. She was taking pictures. At first Max's smile stayed in place. "What are you doing?" Click. It was as if the sound of the shutter woke him from a trance. He was naked. She was taking pictures. His smile faded. He said it again. "What are you doing?" So lowered the camera. Not even her bare breasts could distract Max from the sudden cold rush of reality and the feeling of intense exposure. "I woke up, and you looked so beautiful in the light. I didn't think." Max shook his head. "Don't do that." She put the camera down in her lap. Her eyes were wide. "Max, I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking. You looked so beautiful in the light. I just acted on instinct." A sense of vulnerability prickled over his skin, a sense of waking out of a deep dream. He felt cold. All of a sudden, he needed to get away from Zoe's huge eyes. "I'm taking a shower." "Max, but he didn't turn back. He stood under the hot spray a few seconds later, but it couldn't melt the block of ice that had formed in his gut. He didn't have to look at his phone to know that it would be blowing up after he'd rescheduled a whole day of meetings yesterday. His brother Nikos had been renowned for this kind of behavior, going AWOL and then turning up in the tabloids, falling out of a club with 2 women on his arm, in a different city to the one where he'd been due to attend meetings. Sharif was a little more circumspect, but recently he'd been at the mercy of some unfavorable kiss and tells after one of too many discarded lovers had had enough. Max did not do this. Max had had a well-honed instinct to keep out of the limelight after his parents' toxicity had blighted his and his sister's lives. He'd always been the solid brother, the one who never failed to turn up to meetings and was discreet in all matters. He knew he and Zoe would be all over the papers by now, because they'd been seen together at more than one event, and if he wasn't mistaken, he was pretty sure a paparazzo had been following them yesterday. He hadn't even cared all that much, and yet it had taken her lifting a camera to her face to wake him up. He hadn't been able to see her face. He'd only seen that lens. It had made him realize just how far under his skin he'd let her burrow. All the way. No, Max rejected that thought as he stepped out of the shower. He slung a towel around his hips and saw his face in the mirror over the sink. What was he doing? Letting a woman get under his skin like this? When there was no way it was going to last. The most important person in the world to Max was Sasha, his sister. As soon as he'd been old enough, he'd taken Sasha out of his father's house and had become her guardian. His father had died soon after, and anyway, he hadn't even noticed that his daughter was gone from his care, because she hadn't even been his. Their experiences had fostered an unspoken agreement between them never to repeat the mistakes of their parents. What he felt here now with Zoe was some kind of lust-induced craziness. He knew better than this. He knew not to send mixed messages, and that was exactly what he was doing. Telling her one thing but behaving in the completely opposite way. When he thought of the previous day, wandering around Venice, hand in hand, taking a gondola, which no self-respecting Italian would ever do, he cringed. Max and his sister had been the flotsam and jetsam in the wreckage of their parents' toxic marriage, and while Sasha had no interest in the Marchetti group, Max did. He'd made it his priority to ensure that he helped to build a legacy that would prove to be far more stable and durable and lasting than any marriage. That was what mattered, not the illusion of something that didn't exist. He knew this was an unprecedented situation. He'd never wanted a woman for longer than a couple of dates, so it would be hard to do what he had to. But he would do it because he couldn't offer Zoe anything more. Zoe sat on the bed for a long moment after Max disappeared into the bathroom. She didn't have to be a genius. Zoe's brain wouldn't work. She felt pain, incredible pain, deep inside. The kind of pain she'd only ever felt once before. The kind of pain she'd vowed never to feel again. Yet here she was, being eviscerated. Her instinct was to get away as fast as possible, curl up into a ball and push the pain back down. He got too close. He's doing you a favor. Somehow she managed to formulate words to sound normal. I think you're right. Better for both of us to put this behind us and move on. Max smiled, but it was a kind of smile she'd never seen before. Tight. Goodbye, Zoe. He walked to the door, picked up a small bag, and didn't look back. Zoe wasn't sure how long she stood there, breathless from the speed at which Max had ruthlessly cut her out of his life. She walked over to the balcony and marveled at how, within 24 hours, this view that had felt so full of promise and wonder now felt tawdry and mocking. She turned back into the suite, empty. No trace left of the man who had dominated it so easily. No, his trace was left inside her, a wound that would be added to her other wounds and which would, in time, become a scar, but not visible, like the scars on her face. Invisible. Anger rose inside her, anger at herself, for stepping into the blazing center of a fire that she had known would consume her. She'd already learned a lesson at the hands of Dean Simpson, a lesson in not letting herself be weak. How could she have let it happen again? So soon? So fatally? Because Max didn't make you feel weak, said an inner voice. He'd made her feel strong, empowered. And yet even now she could hear Max's voice in her head, denying that he'd given her those things, those feelings. They'd been within her. All he'd done was encourage her to find them. And he'd not held back from telling her what his life had been like. Why he had no interest in a relationship or anything more permanent. He'd been scarred too, except, unlike Zoe, he'd not let himself get lost in a fantasy. He'd not let his innate weakness rise up to drown him. Again. Are you taking Nikos's place in the tabloids now that he's an apparently happily settled married man? Sharif's tone was mocking. Max curbed his urge to scowl at his older brother. Downtown Manhattan was laid out all around them, visible through the huge windows. People were like industrious ants on the sidewalks, but it was wasted on Max. I hardly think a couple of photos in a few tabloids is up to Nikos's standards, or yours, I might add. You're racking up quite the tally of kiss and tells, not the best judge of women who can be discreet. Now Sharif did scowl. Not that it marred the handsomeness of his dark good looks. Who is she, anyway? Max bristled at his question. You don't need to worry about who she is. It's over. Sharif cocked an eyebrow. Pity. The board are still skittish, in spite of Nikos's reformation. If you were to settle down too. Max waited for the inevitable sense of rejection that usually accompanied any suggestion or notion of permanence, but all he felt was hollow. Irritation made him say, There's as much likelihood of that happening as of you getting married. To his surprise, Sharif didn't immediately rebut that statement. When Max looked at him, his brother's expression was one he couldn't read, almost resigned. Max frowned. Sharif? The expression passed as if Max had imagined it, and a familiar mocking arrogance animated his brother's face again as he said, That's enough gossiping. Let's get on with it. By all means. Max responded, more than happy to focus on work. A few hours later, in his hotel suite in Manhattan, Max nursed a whiskey as he looked out over the glittering lights of the city that never slept. He felt as if he might never sleep again. Restless under his skin, hungry in his blood. For her, he still wanted Zoe. He'd never wanted a woman for longer than a brief period. A tantalizing prospect struck him. Maybe he'd been too hasty. Maybe he could come to an arrangement with her in which... No. He ruthlessly shut down that train of thought. She wasn't that kind of woman. Sophisticated. Who knew the rules of the game? He'd been her first lover. She just got under his skin. All he had to do was remember Zoe's reaction earlier, when he'd broken things off. The way she'd gone so pale, her eyes huge, stricken. It had only confirmed for him that he was doing the right thing. They had no future. As it was, he'd already dragged her into the public eye. After accusing her of being a paparazzi, the irony was not welcome. But he couldn't regret seducing her, not when it had been so earth-shatteringly satisfying. He had no right to give her any hope for more. She'd been a brief aberration, a temptation he shouldn't have succumbed to, a temptation he wouldn't succumb to again. 3 weeks later, Zoe was gritty-eyed after another broken night's sleep, broken by dreams about Max, and nightmares. In the latest one she'd been in Venice, endlessly wandering the narrow labyrinthine streets, searching for him, only to catch a tiny glimpse at the last second before he disappeared around another corner. She hated herself for being so weak. He'd dumped her. She told herself yet again that he'd done her a favor as she walked to her local corner shop for supplies. There was nothing like being back in the grittier end of London to remind her of where she belonged. So when she looked down and saw the pictures on the front page of the tabloid newspaper, she had to blink several times, wondering if she was still dreaming or hallucinating. It was Max. He was naked. He was smiling intimately at whoever was taking the picture. Drapes fluttered behind him. For a second Zoe felt as if someone had skewered her with a red-hot poker, but then she realized that these weren't different pictures. These were her pictures. Just after she'd taken this picture, his demeanor had changed utterly. And then he'd dumped her. She hadn't even looked back at those photos herself since that day, not wanting to see the moment when his face had gone from dreamy and sexy to icy cold. Yet now they were plastered all over these grubby tabloids for all the world to see. I don't think it's a good idea, Miss Collins. Zoe tried not to sound as desperate as she felt after a long day of trying to track Max down. He'd ignored all her attempts to call or text him, but she knew he was here at his townhouse. Hamish, please. I need to speak to him. Max's housekeeping manager looked as if he was about to close the door in her face, but then he stood back and said tersely, I'll ask him. Wait here. Zoe stood in the hall of the stunning townhouse. It was a very different reception from the last one she'd received here. Now it couldn't be frostier. After a long moment Hamish returned. He'll see you for a few minutes. Follow me. Relief flooded Zoe, followed quickly by trepidation. She'd been trying to get to Max all day, but now that she was here she wasn't even sure what she would say. Hamish led her into a room she hadn't been in before, a large study, dark wood-paneled walls, shelves, modern technology, a TV on the wall with the news on mute, and Max, standing behind his desk in a shirt and dark trousers, sleeves rolled up, hands on hips. To see him again in close proximity almost made her stumble. She locked her legs. The door closed behind her, and Max walked over to a drinks cabinet, pouring himself a drink. He didn't offer her one. He turned around. He looked calm, but Zoe could feel the tension. Why did you do it, Zoe? He ignored her denial. How much did you get? If you'd offered them to me first, I might have given you more. She felt sick. She'd been feeling sick all day. I didn't. A sense of desperation flooded Zoe, eclipsing the nausea. I didn't sell the photos, Max. I swear. I have no idea how the papers got them. Max put his glass down and perched on one corner of his desk, for all the world as if this was a civil conversation and as if she hadn't just spoken. I mean, I shouldn't be surprised. After all, you have form. The first time we met you were taking my picture and trespassing. Zoe's cheeks grew hot. This isn't the same. No, it's not. It's worse. His voice was like the crack of a whip. Zoe's insides were clenched so tight she almost had cramp. I know how much you hate your privacy being invaded. You know me. You know I would never do something like this. Max just looked at her, no expression on his face, those silver eyes cold as mercury. I thought I did. I thought you were an open book. I thought you were different, but you weren't at all. I knew you weren't happy when I broke things off. He continued, but I had no idea you'd stoop so low to get back at me. or that you were so mercenary. You had me fooled with your apparent lack of interest in anything material. Your humble but cozy flat. So flinched inwardly. How could he think that had all been an act? But her conscience pricked hard. In a way he was right. It wasn't the whole truth of her existence. But Max would never want to hear about that. Not now. All she could say was, I didn't do this. Max stood up straight, folded his arms. Stop with the lies, Zoe. They make fools of both of us. We know the money went into an account in a bank right beside where you live. Zoe stared at Max, absorbing his words. Shock, dismay, and confusion made her head throb. Who could have done this to her? To him? Max's arms were locked so tight across his chest that Zoe could see his biceps bulging under the thin material of his shirt. The blood quickened in her veins. Even now, in the midst of all of this, when he was looking at her as if he wanted to, his lip curled. Take the grubby money that you got from the papers and get out. You won't get anything more from me. So if that's why you came, it's a wasted journey. Max, I swear, I didn't. But she stopped talking. Max was a cold, remote statue, not interested, convinced of her guilt. She felt incredible hurt that he could be so quick to misjudge her. Get out, he said. I never want to see you again. Something cracked apart inside her, breaking into 1,000 pieces. She thought she'd protected herself so well, but she hadn't protected herself at all. It took a few seconds for the red haze to fade enough in Max's head for him to realize that Zoe had left. For a stomach-plummeting second, he thought he might have actually imagined that she'd come here, that she'd stood in front of him protesting her innocence. Hair down, those scars visible against her pale skin, her eyes as big as he remembered, her mouth as lush, as tempting. He unlocked his arms from his chest and unclenched his jaw. She had been here. He could smell her scent in the air and had to resist the urge to breathe it deep. No, he picked up his glass and drained it in one gulp. He didn't even wince as it flamed down his throat. He barely felt it. His fingers gripped the heavy crystal so tightly he had to relax them for fear of cracking it. His skin still crawled when he thought of the look on his executive assistant's face that morning when he'd arrived at the Marchetti offices shortly after dawn. And the fact that he hadn't been sleeping well for the past few weeks was not something he wanted to associate with the women who had just left. His assistant hadn't been able to meet his eyes as he cleared his throat and said, Have you seen the papers yet, sir? Max, feeling irritable, had replied, No. Why? There's something you should see. His assistant had laid out a sheaf of the main tabloids on his desk, and it had taken Max a moment even to understand what he was looking at. Himself, naked. His first reaction hadn't even been anger or shock. It had been to remember that morning, with the sun coming up on the Grand Canal in Venice, the breeze cooling his overheated body, the sense of contentment and sensual satisfaction that had oozed through him, along with that delicious peak of anticipation. The picture in the papers had captured that moment when he'd looked around and caught Zoe with her camera raised to her face. He'd smiled, not minding in that first instance that she was taking his picture. And then reality had hit like a bucket of cold water. He'd realized just how lax he'd been, how blinded by lust, to let someone get that close enough to steal his very soul. The thing that burned and roiled in Max's gut most was that a lifetime of cynicism had let him down. He never would have suspected Zoe of having the kind of wherewithal to do something like this, and yet up until he'd met her, he would have assumed anyone was capable of anything, no matter how innocent they looked or acted. He thought of all the little moments when he doubted she could really be that innocent. Naive? No, not naive. Unjaded. For all he knew, she could have faked her virginity. She told him beforehand, so of course that would have made him less likely to question if she really was or not. He knew what good actors women were. He'd seen his mother lie over and over again about her numerous affairs until she hadn't cared any more and had freely admitted septed before. Except he felt nothing, no stirring of interest. Nada. Zilch. He turned to his drink. His libido only seemed to come to life at night now, when he woke sweaty and aching all over after explicitly sexual dreams featuring a treacherous liar and a thief. Max, you dark horse. Are congratulations in order? Max looked up and to his side to see the smirking face of photographer Pierre Garden, another reminder of Zoe that he didn't need. What are you talking about, Pierre? Your girlfriend was working with me this week, and the rumor on set was that she's pregnant. She kept disappearing to the bathroom, but she's still the best assistant I've had in a long time. I hate to admit it, but I think she's got real potential too. Max swiveled around on his stool. He could see Pierre's mouth moving, but the sound was muffled. He wanted to shake the man. He cut through whatever he was saying now. What did you say? Pierre stopped talking and cocked his head, eyes narrowing on Max. Actually, so never mentioned you. Maybe you're not together anymore. Maybe the baby isn't yours. I can't keep up with these young people and their love affairs. Baby. Pregnant. Max was having a hard time getting his brain to absorb those words. It was so nonsensical. And then Max had a mental image of Zoe in bed with another man, and his brain went white hot. Where is she? Pierre frowned. I have no idea. She went home. Back to London, presumably. Max's brain was melting. Pregnant. Yet she hadn't called him. Do you blame her? Asked a caustic voice. The words he'd last thrown at her reverberated in his head. Get out. I never want to see you again. Was he even the father? Max, are you okay? No, he wasn't. For weeks now he'd been avoiding thinking about Zoe's stricken face when she'd come to his townhouse that night, and her entreaty, you know I'd never do something like this. Avoiding the niggling question as to why she would have come to his house if she'd really leaked the photos and been paid for them. Surely that wasn't the action of a guilty person. Surely she would have just disappeared with the money. His conscience pricked. His team had offered to look deeper into the leak of the photos, to confirm beyond doubt that it had been Zoe. But Max had stopped them, telling himself that he knew. But now he wasn't so sure at all. The money, that I'd given most of it away to charity. And that was when Dean got angry with me, when he realized I'd been getting rid of it. Zoe lifted her chin. If you don't believe me, you can check the bank account where the money from the pictures was lodged. It's in Dean's name. He didn't even try very hard to cover his tracks. Max looked at Zoe, a small, obstinately cynical part of him refusing to give in to what his gut was telling him, that she was innocent, always had been, in more ways than one. How do I know you weren't working together? That you haven't spent your entire inheritance and you're looking to make more money at my expense. Zoe went so pale that for a moment Max thought she might faint. Instead, she stalked past him and went to the door, opening it. She looked at him. Get out, Max. A lead weight seemed to be stuck in his gut, and then he remembered the reason why he'd come here in the first place. He said, there's something else. I'd bumped into Pierre Garden. He told me that you might be pregnant. Is it true? Zoe looked at Max. She forced herself to breathe, to let oxygen get to her brain. Anger, betrayal, and so many other emotions roiled in her gut that she felt lightheaded, all mixed up with a clawing need to throw herself into Max's arms and wind herself around him like a vine. She forced all that out. The urge to self-protect was paramount. When she felt as if she could sound calm, she said, "That's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. Pierre said you weren't well." Zoe's face grew warm and she avoided Max's eye. "I had a bug. That was all." "So you're not pregnant?" She gripped the handle of the door. "Please leave. Max, I have an English class to teach today, and I'm already late." Max sounded frustrated. "So, if you are, you need to tell me." She finally looked at him, focusing on anger to block out all the other disturbing emotions. "Why? When I know exactly how you feel about having a family. You're the last man I'd choose to be the father of my child. If you were pregnant with my baby, I would take responsibility. You wouldn't be alone." The thought of Max having to take responsibility for her made bile rise inside Zoe. She said, "Even if I was pregnant, I wouldn't come to you, because I don't need to. No matter how much money I give to charity, the interest alone on what's left keeps me rich beyond anything I know what to do with. So if I was pregnant, which I'm not, I wouldn't need you anyway. Please leave." Zoe begged silently, just wanting to escape Max's far too probing eyes. Relief moved through her when he finally walked to the door and stepped over the threshold. He turned around. "Grim, if what you say is true, then I owe you an apology. Simpson victimized you as much as me." Hurt gripped her again at his reluctance to trust her. "You don't owe me anything." Zoe shut the door and stood in a stupor for a long moment, staring at her closed door. She heard the sound of the main door closing heavily, the throttle of a powerful engine. In spite of her brave words just now, she knew it wasn't the last she'd see of Max. Not by a long shot. Not just because he might come back to apologize, as his integrity would demand, but for another, far more pressing reason. Her hand went to her belly. She'd lied. Unforgivably. She was pregnant, and her little bump was growing every day. But the shock of having Max here in her space, confronting her, suggesting she might have been colluding with Dean Simpson, had decimated any urge she might have had to tell him today. Of course she would tell him she was pregnant, when she could do so on her terms, when she could prepare herself for the inevitable distaste she'd see on his face, when she would be able to stand in front of him and tell him calmly and rationally that she was prepared to do this on her own and didn't expect him to take responsibility. Terrified, but filled with a sense of focus and a determination to get over her fear of loss and grief, she knew she owed it to her baby to do her best to try, to create a secure life for them both, to shield them from the fear she would feel every day. It was time to reassess her experiences and do things differently. She had a child to support now. She couldn't continue like an out-of-work student, skirting around the edges of life, ignoring the fact that she had the means to live well. It wasn't just about her and her guilt anymore. Max felt sick. It had taken the most rudimentary of internet searches to find the news reports on the tragic crash that had killed Zoe's family, leaving her the sole survivor. There had been pictures of the car wreckage that had made him feel weak and pictures of Zoe taken before the crash. Her father had been tall and dashingly handsome, her mother blonde and beautiful, like Zoe. There'd been pictures of a 3-year-old Zoe holding her baby brother, grinning proudly, and a lot of breathless speculation about the young, tragically orphaned Harris. It also hadn't been hard to find the philanthropic foundation she'd set up to donate money anonymously to various charities. Set up, Max suspected, on her 18th birthday. He recalled how she'd sounded almost bewildered when she'd mentioned the fact that no matter what she did, the interest kept growing on her remaining inheritance. He'd never met anyone before who'd actively tried to get rid of money. The way she denied herself out of a sense of guilt and grief made Max's chest feel tight. A knock sounded on his home office door. Hamish stuck his head around it. "Lunch, boss?" Max didn't feel hungry. He stood up. "No. Can you get my assistant to meet me here? And call my legal team. I have some information for them." "Sure thing." Hamish left and Max walked over to the window, looking out unseeingly. Zoe wasn't pregnant. And even if she was, as she pointed out, she didn't actually need his support. He should be feeling relieved. She was right. A family was the last thing he'd ever wanted. A baby. No matter what kind of ache he might have felt when he thought of his brother Nikos and his family. An ache that was still there now. He'd misjudged Zoe badly. And any sense of betrayal that she hadn't told him about her family was fading fast. He could understand why. A mixture of complicated emotions roiled in his gut. He didn't usually judge people out of hand. He was actually far less likely to jump to conclusions than either of his brothers. But with Zoe, she'd pushed his buttons from the moment he'd first seen her. And at the first sign of an opportunity to believe the worst about her, he jumped at it. The worst thing was, he knew exactly why he'd reacted like that. Because he hadn't been prepared to admit that he still wanted her, that he wasn't ready to let her go. And more. Much more. Zoe stood on the stony beach and looked out at the Irish Sea. It was a blustery day with leaden skies. Typical Irish weather. She turned around and looked up to the cliff behind her, where a distinctive yellow house stood out. That had been her home. The family home where she'd felt loved and safe, and as if nothing could touch her. A deep sigh moved through her as the wind whipped her hair around her face. She'd spent the last few days in a storage facility, going through her family's possessions, and she felt wrung out, but also a little lighter, as if a weight was finally lifting off her shoulders. She faced the sea again and tried to ignore the dull pain that dogged her every step. Max. Every time she thought about him, she forced her mind away again. But like a well-worn groove, her mind kept going over all the reasons why she was so reluctant to contact him and reveal the truth about her pregnancy. He'd never promised her anything but a finite affair. He believed that she'd betrayed his trust, which just confirmed how little he'd really thought of her. He didn't want a relationship, or a child, or a family. And even more damningly, she now knew why he'd appeared on her doorstep in London. He hadn't really wanted to verify her guilt or innocence. He'd been there to see if she was pregnant, because the last thing he wanted was more adverse publicity. She cursed herself again for letting him close enough to hurt her, devastate her, fatally. No, she told herself now, not fatal. She was still here, whole, pregnant. She would have to tell him sooner or later and deal with the fact that he would be in her life in some capacity forever, but not today. So turned around to walk away from the sea, back up towards the hotel where she was staying, while she went through her family's things. She'd only taken a few steps into the lobby when she heard her name being called. So, she stopped. The voice was deep, hypnotic. She didn't want to turn around. It couldn't be. And yet no one knew her here. She turned around. Max was standing a few feet away in dark clothes. He'd never looked more beautiful or sexy. Zoe felt weak. "What are you doing here? How did you know where I was?" Max took a step towards her. She stepped back, a self-protective reflex. She saw his jaw clench and felt ridiculously like apologizing. "I went to your flat in London. Your neighbor told me you'd moved out and that you were taking a trip to Dublin. It wasn't hard to track you down. Not for a billionaire with means at his disposal, Zoe thought to herself. She could feel herself responding to his proximity. She wanted to drink him in. She wanted to reach up and pull his head down and feel that hard mouth on hers. Every part of her body tingled with awareness, and she vaguely wondered if it had anything to do with being pregnant. Pregnant. She wasn't ready. Not today. Coward. Feeling desperate, she asked, "Why are you here, Max? I thought we'd said all we had to say. Can we go somewhere more private?" Zoe looked around. People were practically tripping over themselves when they saw Max Marchetti in this very mediocre hotel lobby. Zoe felt like rolling her eyes. He literally was too beautiful to be out in public without causing an incident. "You have a room here?" Zoe's mind seized at the thought of him in her small suite, but there was nowhere else private, and as much as she didn't want to tell him about the pregnancy, she knew she had to. Reluctantly, she walked over to the elevator, without waiting to see if he followed her, but she could feel him behind her. Tall, powerful. His scent was exotic, musky, sexy. The tension crackled between them when they were in the elevator, so much that Zoe got an electric shock when she pushed the button for her floor. It was a relief to get out and walk down the short corridor to her room. She went in and immediately went over to the window, crossing her arms, looking at Max warily as he followed her in. She noticed more now. His hair was longer, jaw stubbled. He looked tired, disheveled. Her heart squeezed with an unbidden urge to know if he was okay. And then she lambasted herself for being weak. She hated him. His betrayal of her was far worse than anything she'd unwittingly done to him. But when he looked at her, she could feel herself aligning towards him, her head and body at war. She was melting, aching. She didn't hate him at all. "Max, what do you want?" Her voice was sharp, panicked. "You." Max just restrained himself from saying it. Seeing Zoe up close again made him feel primal. Her lithe petite form, that honey blonde hair, wild and messy from the wind, cheeks pink, eyes like two stormy oceans. He forced his brain out of his pants. "I came to say I'm sorry. I should have given you the benefit of the doubt. I knew you better than that." The pink faded from her cheeks. She looked pale now. "You've got proof that Dean hacked into my account and sold the pictures." Her voice was flat. "No, I didn't need to. I should have trusted you. I gave his name to the authorities. They informed me that he was picked up in Spain yesterday, and he's admitted everything. They're extraditing him back to Ireland to face charges. I won't hold back from bringing the full force of the law down on him, Zoe." Oh, it shouldn't surprise Max that Zoe looked troubled at that news. She probably felt sorry for her ex. She said, "You didn't have to come all the way here to tell me that, but thank you." He nodded. "Yes, I did. The first time I saw you, I accused you of being something you weren't. You have an effect on me. Normally, I can be rational, but with you, that goes out the window." Zoe bit her lip. "I can't help that." Now she sounded injured. Max cursed himself, shook his head. "You got too close, Zoe. Closer than I've ever let anyone get. The only other person who knows me as well is my sister. That's why I let you go in Venice. When you took my picture, and when it didn't immediately feel like a violation, it was like a wake-up call. I panicked." His forced-out words to the weight in his gut. "And then, when the pictures came out, I jumped on any excuse to damn you, so I wouldn't have to acknowledge how much you'd got to me, how much I wanted you, how much I still want you now. pushing you away was easier than being honest with myself." Zoe's eyes went wide, color flooding her cheeks. He could see the pulse at her throat beating hectically. I don't want you any more," she said. He moved closer, unable not to. Zoe looked at him as if in a trance. "Don't lie, Zoe." She moved back. "So what if I do still want you? You dumped me, remember?" Max stopped right in front of her. Her scent, fresh and sweet, wound around him. He smelled the sea too, salty. Something in him calmed for the first time in weeks. Maybe that was a mistake. She'd been looking at his mouth. Now her eyes met his. "What's that supposed to mean? What do you want from me?" All Max knew was that what he really wanted was too huge and terrifying to articulate. Far easier to focus on the hunger that had been eating him up for weeks. He reached out, put his hands on her arms. He felt the tension in her body even as she swayed towards him. "I want you. We both want this. We can talk later, So was drowning in a sea of rising lust. The urge to just sink into Max, allow him to seduce her again, was overwhelming. She desperately wanted to forget everything for a moment. Forget the need to think about what he'd said, about what it might mean. She wasn't sure what signal of acquiescence she gave, but Max was tugging her towards him and saying, "Are you sure?" So just nodded, her eyes fixed on his mouth, silently begging him to kiss her. And then he was, and for the first time in months, she felt as if she could breathe again. It was fast and furious. Clothes were dragged off, thrown aside. They only stopped for a moment when they were naked. Zoe touched Max reverently, feeling emotional. She thought she wouldn't see him like this again. He pulled her down onto the bed, and she sank into him, her whole body melting and on fire at the same time. She gasped when his fingers explored her, testing her readiness. He moved over her, and she welcomed him into the cradle of her body, breathing deep as he moved inside her, deeper and deeper, until she couldn't breathe any more and her whole body tightened before the exquisite release. Zoe fell down into a warm, comforting blanket of peace and satisfaction, only vaguely aware of the rush of warmth inside her. When Zoe woke a few hours later, the sun had started dipping in the sky. She had her back to Max. They touched at every point where he spooned her. Her bottom was tucked against the potency of his body, no less potent now, even in sleep. His arm was wrapped around her, his hand splayed across her. So went cold. His hand was right there, on the thickening swell of her belly. Panic gripped her. She moved as stealthily as she could, dislodging his hand, moving out from under his arm. He stirred and said a sleepy Zoe. She mumbled something and fled to the bathroom on jelly legs, closing the door behind her. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were sparkling and her face was flushed. She didn't have to look further to know the evidence of Max's touch would be all over her body. She took in everything he'd said before they'd made love. He'd apologized. He hadn't even sought proof of Dean's guilt. He finally trusted her. He still wanted her. That could be the case. And she couldn't stop the hitch of joy and relief inside her at that fact. But she had to remember what was at stake here. She was pregnant, and as soon as Max knew that everything would change again. Like that morning in Venice, he'd go cold, let her go, because he didn't want more. She couldn't do this, not now, not when she felt so raw. But she had no choice. She had to let him know. She went back into the bedroom and steeled herself, not prepared for the deflation she felt to find Max still asleep. She looked over his body greedily. She noticed that he had shadows under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept for a while, wishful thinking that it might have anything to do with her. She dressed quickly, quietly, wanting to be ready to face him. Max stirred again, and those gray eyes opened. He looked for her and found her. Came up on his elbow, smiled sleepily, sexily, held out his hand. Hey, come back here. Zoe teetered on the brink of blurting it all out. She had to tell him. Now. But in this moment, before she said anything, before she ruined it with reality, a different future shimmered between them. A chance to go back into that Max bubble, where time stopped and became magical. Zoe wished she could go back there, even as she knew it wasn't really what she wanted, because she'd suddenly realized here, just a couple of kilometers from her old family home, what she did really want. And she couldn't bear to have Max lay it to waste. Not just yet. Instead of blurting out what she should be saying, she said, I'm sorry. I can't do this. I can't just go back to what we had for as long as it might last. I want more, Max. She turned before she could see his expression change and fled the room, heading blindly downstairs and back out of the hotel, down to the stony beach. Zoe felt Max's presence before she saw him. She was sitting on the beach, knees pulled up to her chest. He sat down beside her. She didn't look at him. He surprised her, asking, Is this near where your house was? She nodded. It's the big yellow house up on the cliff behind us. This beach is where we used to come and play. It's beautiful here. You're lucky. Zoe felt a pang to think of Max's toxic childhood. At least she'd known happiness and love for a while. Knowing that she couldn't delay any longer, Zoe stood up. Max rose fluidly beside her. She tried not to be so aware of his body. Max, there's something. They both looked at each other. Max's mouth quirked. You first. No, you please. Coward, an inner voice mocked her. She pushed it down. Max huffed out a breath of air, ran a hand through his hair, making it stick up messily, sexily. Okay. I want to say that when I came to your flat and found out you weren't pregnant, I expected to be relieved. After all, having a baby is the last thing I've ever wanted. A family. You told me. And she really didn't need reminding. Not now. But the truth is that I wasn't relieved. What I felt was a lot more ambiguous. Zoe's breath stalled for a second. She looked at Max. What are you saying? He shrugged minutely. Just that I realized I'd changed. Seeing Nikos with his family, seeing how happy he is, it made me realize that not all families are toxic. Mine wasn't. Zoe said, almost to herself. My mother and father adored each other and us. It had been so perfect, and she realized now that a part of her had always afraid she'd never attain that level of perfection, more than she was ever afraid of loss or grief, if she was brutally being honest with herself. Max continued. It made me realize that perhaps a baby wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Zoe stumbled backwards so abruptly that Max reached out as if to steady her. She ducked out of his reach, dreading him touching her for fear he'd see his effect on her. Why would you say this now? Dear God, did he know? Could he tell? He'd always been able to read her mind. He frowned. Believe me, it's the last thing I ever thought I'd hear myself admit to anyone. So shook her head. You know, don't you? You're just saying that now because her breaths came choppy and fast. Max frowned. Know what? So, what is it? She turned away, but Max caught her arm, turning her back. He was close, too close. So, what the hell is going on? The words tumbled out, finally. I am pregnant, Max. I lied in London because it was too much, seeing you in my flat. You were saying that stuff about me colluding with Dean, and I couldn't believe you still didn't trust me. And I was so hurt. I couldn't tell you then. She stopped. Max was looking at her, his face stripped bare of expression. She saw when her words sank in. He let her arm go, stood back. You are pregnant? She nodded and braced herself for his inevitable reaction, in spite of what he just said. Surely the reality would remind him of how he really felt. But what she saw was dawning anger. When were you going to tell me? After you'd had the baby? When it was 3 months old? The way Nikos had to find out about his son. No, I don't know. I was going to tell you soon. How could she articulate what she'd been afraid of? First, that he would reject his unborn child, and now that he would reject her. Max, I'm sorry. I should have told you that day in London. He looked at her for a long moment, a slightly shell-shocked expression on his face. And then he said, "This changes everything." So looked wary. What do you mean? We're a family now.